Video games have changed dramatically in the past 50 years. They have slowly transitioned from humble 2D games into massive multi-million-dollar projects, complete with sprawling open worlds and the latest advancements in graphics and audio. As technology continues to rapidly evolve, and as old hardware starts to fail, it's now more important than ever to properly preserve and document the history and development behind these classic games. Through the use of emulation, a vintage video game can be experienced outside of its original targeted platform. This makes it possible for the game to entertain a new generation of players, even decades after its release. This is how I was introduced to the 1983 arcade game Sinistar. Sinistar was developed by the Chicago arcade manufacturer Williams Electronics, the same company that gave us coin-operated hits like Defender, Robotron, and Joust. Their video games reflected the same engineering innovations and new groundbreaking features found in their pinball machines. In fact, the Sinistar is the first video game character portrayed on screen with lip-sync animation and recorded voiceover performed by a professional actor. However, Sinistar came out just as the North American video game crash of 1983 started, preventing the game from reaching the same commercial success as its predecessors. With the rise of the internet in the 1990s, Sinistar gained a new cult following as players rediscovered its technical ingenuity, intense difficulty, and an unforgettable quotable villain. Not only has Sinistar become a cult classic, the game has proven to be an important seminal title in more ways than just one. Many team members involved with its creation would later contribute to several influential and pioneering projects in both the gaming and personal computer industries. 2 years before the game's 40th anniversary, something truly unexpected happened. Digital copies of the source code for 5 Williams games, including Sinistar, had survived and were uploaded online for everyone to see. The comments and additional unused files left behind in the preserved Sinistar codebase provide a much better understanding of what happened during development and allows us to analyze the game in ways that have never been done before. While this discovery gives us a rare, unprecedented view inside these classic games, a massive amount of work was still needed if one were to actually use the code to assemble or modify the game itself. As the person responsible for restoring the Sinistar codebase back to a buildable state, I felt it was important to document this endeavor as well as the game's own intricate development history. Many hours were spent researching engineering logbooks, dozens of Coin-Op magazine articles, printed and recorded interviews, various ephemera, and of course, re-implementing long-forgotten debug features and special effects found in the source files. After completing the retargeting project, I reached out to the engineers and designers who worked on Sinistar and told them about my findings. Thankfully, many of them replied back, and even a few agreed to be interviewed for this video. My aim for this documentary is to share with you the story of Sinistar in the most accurate and comprehensive way possible. Bits and pieces of what happened during development have already been told before, but this is the first time the history specifically related to Sinistar has been presented so thoroughly. Learning how this game was created by following along with the source code and understanding the intentions of the software engineers through their comments was insightful beyond comparison and made me appreciate Sinistar even more. By the end of this video, I hope you feel the same way. Enjoy. To better understand how Sinistar came to be, it's important to have some context with Williams Electronics and how they got into the video game business. Due to the fact that multiple games were being worked on alongside Sinistar, it's also worth discussing some of these Williams titles since they share personnel and similar code. Here is a brief synopsis for those who are not familiar with this multi-directional space shooter. The player controls a small but extremely agile spaceship, and their goal is to stop the creation of the eponymous Sinistar, a sentient, talking skull planet hurtling through the void of outer space, hungry for cowards.
I hunger, coward. Beware.
To destroy this nemesis, the player uses their own unlimited firepower to mine for energy-filled crystals hidden inside nearby space rocks known as planetoids. When the player collects a crystal, it is converted into a Cinibomb, the only weapon that can seek and destroy the Sinistar one piece at a time. Meanwhile, numerous worker and warrior enemies try to interfere and halt the player from carrying out their mission. The red, unarmed workers behave almost like a swarm of insects and can steal crystals from the player if they're not quick enough. Because the crystals are a universal energy source, the workers can use them to assemble the Sinistar rather than destroying it. Fast UFO-like warrior ships protect the Sinistar and the workers by using their laser turrets to instantly kill the player with a single shot. As their population numbers increase, the warriors become more aggressive and group together into dangerous attack squadron formations. If the player avoids the warrior shots and is able to vanquish the Sinistar with enough bombs, then they are automatically warped to the next zone, which contains even more lethal enemies. Since the 1960s, Williams were building a reputation of being important innovators within the coin-op industry. By the end of the 1970s, newly appointed Williams president Mike Stroll led the company into its most successful period as it moved from complex electromechanical components to solid-state electronics with 8-bit microprocessors inside the pinball machine. Stroll's past experience with solid-state at National Semiconductor helped guide the pinball company into the future as the importance of the microprocessor was becoming more evident. As pinball machines began to evolve, the game designers continued managing the various traditional aspects of developing a pinball game, but now they needed help from the engineers in the software department to write game logic programs and work their magic of controlling novel hardware like 7-segment displays, flasher lamps, and digital synthesizer sound effects. One of these pinball software engineers that created many of these attention-grabbing noises was a young man named Sam Dicker. Sam was 22 when he was hired by Williams in 1979, thanks to a connection with another software engineer, Larry DeMar. Meanwhile, DeMar and former Atari pinball programmer Eugene Jarvis were soon hard at work making Defender, the company's first original video game project. Eugene was recommended to Mike Stroll by pinball designer Steve Ritchie, who had also left Atari for Williams. Since no one at the company made a video game before, Defender required new hardware to be designed from the ground up, using the Motorola 6809 CPU as its base. The software team then had to figure out how to use the equipment and make it do new exciting things like displaying a pixel on a television screen. At some point during development, DeMar had to step aside and work on the software for Ritchie's pinball game, Black Knight, and so other software engineers were recruited to provide Eugene with additional support. Around July 1980, 6 months into the development of Defender, Sam joined the team of engineers. He ultimately contributed a substantial amount of code to the game, including audio and special effects. Shortly after Sam joined the dev team, Eugene asked him to come up with a player ship explosion similar to Galaxian's 3-frame animation. Instead of just copying what the Japanese developers did by creating some sprites, Sam used a family of 6809 CPU instructions that he realized were perfect for creating the eye-catching particle effects.
I had this thing where, I've always have, and that's never changed. I always like to come up with something new or different. Look at it. Is there another way to do this? That's when I had the idea for the primitive particle effects of blowing up the ships and making the pixels actually spread apart. Because I hadn't seen that before, at least not in raster, on a raster game.
Despite initial concerns about the game's difficulty, Defender became a tremendous success in early '81, eventually selling over 55,000 units by the end of the year. These were sales numbers Williams had never seen in their entire history. With just one title under their belt, the company had managed to rank third in the industry with overall video game sales. The use of solid-state components had radically changed Williams electronics in just a few short years. The software engineers that used to work directly for the pinball game designers had found a way to create their own profitable games all by themselves. It was obvious to everyone in coin-op that pinball's popularity was being replaced by video games like Pac-Man and Donkey Kong. For many arcade operators, video games were not only more popular with customers, but they were seen as more reliable machines. The high maintenance and downtimes associated with pinball were hurting Williams' overall sales, which was one of the reasons why the Defender project was greenlit in the first place. The company immediately started expanding to keep up with the demand. Williams bought a 60,000 square foot manufacturing plant in Gurnee, Illinois, exclusively for video game manufacturing. The company also purchased a 30,000 square foot office building that would become the new home for the software department. Williams then began hiring a new wave of programmers to produce more lucrative video games that could be built alongside their pinball machines. All this rapid expansion, plus the lack of creative freedom and the crowded workspace, didn't sit well with Eugene and Larry. In April 1981, the two expressed their concerns to Stroll, and a deal was made that would benefit everyone involved. Eugene and Larry were able to leave the company and make games on their own terms with their new video game design firm, VidKids, but they would continue to make games for their former employer as contractors. Williams gave them access to the expensive equipment needed for development, and in return, the company got the first right to refusal for any game they produced. Meanwhile, Sam Dicker had already signed a new contract with Williams that contained a non-compete clause. He didn't know Eugene and Larry refused to sign the same contract until after the fact, and so when they quit to form VidKids, Sam couldn't join them and had to stay behind.
In this business, timing is everything for both player and marketing exec.
The life of a video game is basically 6 months to a year, depending upon the popularity of the game.
Declining pinball sales and no upcoming video games in the production pipeline meant the newly purchased manufacturing plant was quickly running out of machines to build. Williams couldn't afford to wait for their software department to come up with a new game, so they resorted to licensing games in order to keep the assembly lines moving. Licensing a game was expensive, but it reduced a lot of the risk associated with development and playtesting, while also allowing the manufacturer to quickly enter the game into production. First, Williams contacted VidKids and asked them for a new video game that needed to be finished in only 4 months. The duo agreed, and to make the rush job feasible, Larry came up with the idea of having the first game be a deluxe version of Defender called Stargate, further improving upon the original with better hardware and new gameplay features. Then, Williams licensed the Japanese maze game Crush Roller and renamed it to Make Tracks for the US market. Both games were released in late October 1981, almost 1 year after Defender hit the arcades. More video games bearing the Williams logo were finally in production, but making this possible wasn't cheap. The time had come for the new in-house software team to create another hit game as soon as possible. Because of his involvement with Defender, Sam was asked to lead a team of engineers and develop a game of his own design for the company.
What Sam Dicker does for a living is to invent video games. He's one of the resident computer geniuses at Chicago's Williams Electronics Company. Last year, Dicker co-designed Defender, which right now is the #1 coin game in the country. Sam uses this computer for a process he calls birthing, developing new effects for games yet to be invented. The road from here to finished video game may end up costing a company $1 million. But nationwide, Defender is currently earning nearly $8 million a week. What makes a good video game designer?
Well, you have to be a science fiction fan, you have to be a programmer, you have to be kind of an artist. We actually have to first please ourselves, and we're about the most finicky players around. We've played every game until we're bored of it. Just like a movie, you want to get lost in it. You want to forget that you're playing a game. You want to, when the game's over, you want to suddenly realize that you're in the arcade.
It's not entirely clear when production on Sam's game began exactly, but the model number allocated for his project can give us a clue. Stargate and Make Tracks were both released in late October 1981 and given the model numbers 3002 and 3003 respectively, while Sam's game was assigned 3004. Sam initially created some early game engine tests involving a 3D perspective with a spaceship zooming through a starfield, but he didn't find this very fun to play, so he reverted back to 2D.
We always had a game room with some of our games and some of our pinball games, and we had a couple of because there weren't any other video games, so we had a couple of video games from other companies that we were playing with, that we would play with and we get ideas from.
Like with Defender's explosions, Sam continued with his theme of not wanting to repeat what's already been done, or, in this case, making an even better version of something that already exists. I think it's possible that Sam's game may have been inspired by Bosconian, the Japanese multi-directional space shooter from Namco, also released in late 1981.
Lost all!
Many of the game's initial design choices almost feel like they were done as a way to one-up what was already out there in the arcades. To give you a few examples, a top-down perspective was chosen as opposed to Defender's side-scrolling view, and unlike Bosconian, the cabinet monitor was rotated 90 degrees to provide a vertical orientation to the graphics. The controls were also radically changed by replacing Defender's two-way joystick with an off-the-shelf analog joystick that allowed a much smoother and wider range of movement, way more than Bosconian's 8-way directional input. At some point, an asteroid field was added alongside the player ship. In an interview from 2002, Sam explains that the game's physics also follow this design philosophy. With full object-to-object collision detection, I could make the rocks bounce off of each other as well as your ship instead of killing you, which was the convention at the time. The only similarities Sam's game would end up sharing with Defender was the same space shooter genre, some borrowed sound effects, and the ever-important deep space scanner. Everything else beyond this point was out in uncharted territory.
As always, I tend to take on a project and I just get so focused on the nuts and bolts, and I put my head down and I work on stuff, and I kind of lose track of what's going on around me.
While Sam worked on his project, Williams management needed someone who can lead the new software engineers and help come up with profitable game concepts. Enter John Newcomer, a former toy designer who realized that video games were going to be the future of entertainment. He was hired after Thanksgiving 1981 as one of the coin-op industry's first full-time video game designers. John didn't have any previous experience as a programmer, but he did have a background in industrial design. His previous job was at Gordon Barlow Design, the firm known for creating the board game Mousetrap. He was part of a team that regularly held brainstorming sessions where they would quickly invent new toys and games. John's understanding of art, toy design, and game theory, along with his ability to rapidly create prototypes, provided him the opportunity to pitch game ideas directly to Williams management. He came up with two game concepts and presented them to Mike Stroll. One was based off of the sci-fi classic The War of the Worlds, and the other was a flying game that eventually became the arcade hit known as Joust.
Okay, I was a comic book fan.
Right.
For forever. And in fact, I actually met Stan Lee, and he had an impact on Joust. At the time, he was lecturing my senior year in college, and the thing was poorly attended, so he actually had more time, and he even waited for us to come back, and I brought my issue 39 of Spider-Man, and he signed it. You know, he did most of the writing on a lot of the titles.
Right.
You know, you're always coming up with names. He goes, yeah, kid, just keep it simple. Use a name that someone's going to remember. And literally, it took like 2 seconds after I found out that Williams didn't have any real marketing person, because all they did was did brochures to the 100 to 120 distributors. And so all they did was shove them brochures. They weren't marketing to the actual players. And so that's why you had to do something that would give them something where they could then tell their friend, what did they just play? So that's how you just pay attention to what people say, because you never know when you might use that piece of advice. And for sure, I'm going to listen to Stan Lee. That's a given. Okay.
Meanwhile, at VidKids, work was already underway on Robotron 2084, the game that would put twin-stick shooters on the map. After Stargate was completed, Eugene and Larry both worked on their own separate prototypes. Eugene's project eventually turned into Robotron, but Larry spent 2 months working on his own space shooter called Conquest. When they found out that Sam was already coding a very similar game, Jarvis and DeMar decided to cancel the project and focus solely on Robotron. During the development of Joust, John worked closely with the Williams software engineers to bring the game to life. The main program for Joust was written by Bill Futzenreuter, better known by everyone as Futz. According to Joust's source code, Foots started programming the game on February 10th, 1982. One of the biggest contributions to Joust's gameplay that's directly attributed to him is the skidding stop of the player character. To assist Foots, 2 other software engineers were assigned to Joust, Kerry Kolker and Ken Lance. Kerry worked on the diagnostics ROM and routines for displaying messages in-game, while Ken mainly worked with special graphic effects like the attract mode marquee screen, the procedurally generated lava bubbles, the player death poof effect, and image compression routines. Ken got his foot in the door at Williams by impressing management with his demos that generated pseudo 3D effects while working around the limitations of using painfully slow hardware. With a clock speed of only 1 MHz, getting the best performance out of the Motorola 6809 was definitely a challenge for the Williams software engineers. An example of the CPU's lack of speed can be seen in real time during the attract mode for Joust. The animation of the Joust logo appearing is actually the result of the CPU running the image decompression routine so slowly that you can see the graphics being drawn on screen instead of just displaying instantaneously. Even experienced Joust players can tell you that the game suffers from slowdown when a large number of enemies are being processed at once, though this side effect can help make gameplay slightly easier during intense waves. Robotron was released around March 1982, while the final touches on Joust happened between late May and early June. Joust faced considerable opposition during development, as it was a radical departure from the proven success of sci-fi shooters. John had to constantly defend his project and convince Mike Stroll that the game would sell despite industry experts and arcade operators saying otherwise. In the end, John was right, and Joust became another hit for Williams. Thanks to his work, Ken Lance was offered a promotion, and he accepted the role of software department manager for game development. In May 1982, a software engineer by the name of Noah Falstein had joined the company. Noah already had 2 years' experience of programming video games when he was brought on board. For his first game industry job, he worked on several electronic projects at toy company Milton Bradley for both the Atari VCS as well as an abandoned computer that was similar to the ill-fated Coleco Atom. Unfortunately, nearly all of his work at Milton Bradley was canceled by management. After switching from home consoles to coin-op, Noah found the prospect of working with powerful arcade hardware to be much more appealing. It was because of this previous game and toy company experience, along with a shared sense of humor, that John Newcomer started interacting with Noah.
It was interesting because one of the things that Williams introduced me to, he was the first full-time game designer I ever met. I was 2.5 years into the games industry before I met somebody who did nothing but design games.
John had a portfolio with him and shared with Noah some of his sketches and design documents, including a new game concept that he had just finished called Juggernaut.
This is where the phrasing of this has to be very careful, because Sam is like a really nice guy, and he was put in over his head into something that he wasn't qualified to do.
After roughly a year, Sam's project had completely stalled, while development on both Robotron and Joust had wrapped up and were in production. He had created a prototype game engine, but there were no enemies, no story, just a spaceship floating around on a scrolling star field with some fancy controls. At first glance, it looked like Sam didn't produce anything substantial, but in actuality, he had spent the past year perfecting the game engine's multitasking operating system, producing at least 3 different versions. In my email correspondence with Ken Lance, he explained to me what happened. Sam was a phenomenal programmer, and those operating systems were impressive to say the least, but Sam was uncomfortable heading up the project, and as often is the case with any developer, didn't see how capable his invention was. When you're developing something, you're acutely aware of its shortcomings and how it could be better, and you fail to have the perspective to see just how good what you have produced actually is. Caught in this mode of thinking, Sam was constantly improving his software and never finishing it.
To this day, I really don't like being in charge of a department, and I like to get my hands dirty and be the individual contributor who's writing the code and stuff.
Knowing how important this game was to the company and realizing that team management wasn't for him, Sam was under tremendous pressure to develop his prototype into a completed game. As company president, Mike Stroll realized he had to make an executive decision immediately. Either save Sam's game or kill the entire project. He saw that the game engine had potential, but with no characters or story outline, there was nothing for the player to fight against. Stroll hosted an emergency brainstorming session held outside of the company at a local Chicago hotel in the suburbs. In addition to Sam and John Newcomer, several employees including Paul Dassault, Ken Fidesna, and Steve Ritchie were invited to help come up with a scenario and enemies for the game.
I can't remember who all he called, but I don't know, maybe there's like 15 people. And the topic of the conversation is, here's what Sam has, and let's figure out what are we going to do with it. And, you know, people came up with maybe one or two little ideas, and it was mostly Steve Ritchie and I talking.
John soon found himself in a similar environment to his earlier days working at Gordon Barlow. Instead, this time he was helping rapidly design a game concept rather than a physical toy.
Nobody there except Steve Ritchie knew how to brainstorm. And where I was at, brainstorming was a way of life. We would have these impromptu brainstorm meetings all the time. And I was coached on how to brainstorm ideas, and that the first thing you do is you need to visualize what this thing looks like from beginning to end, so that now you can communicate it to these different personality types. Some people, they needed a sketch, and it's like, okay, model maker, here, this is what it looks like. And then you show everybody who's working on this, here's what it looks like, but once you then make a prototype and stuff, then you evolve it. But at least somebody knows this is kind of what we're thinking about, looking at something from beginning to end.
He then spent the next 2 days or so piecing the ideas together to create a cohesive 9-page design document. Being an avid Marvel Comics fan, John was partly inspired by the character Ego the Living Planet and decided to use a giant laughing skull in space as the antagonist for the player. He gave the character and project a new placeholder name, Juggernaut. To make the Juggernaut speak and taunt the player, it was decided to reuse some pinball hardware the company had previously designed. The speech board was yet another pioneering innovation from Williams and was first released with Gorgar, revealed in 1979 to great fanfare. Juggernaut would now become the company's first video game to use the same board. Thanks to writer Paul Drury, we have these scans of the original Juggernaut design documents presented here in high resolution for the first time ever. As expected, this first draft contains many differences from the final game. However, the overall objective and gameplay mechanics stayed consistent throughout development. Here, John describes an unused intro. At the game startup, a large glowing mass explodes, releasing fragments throughout the universe. These fragments are tridextron crystals, the universal energy source. Crystals settle down on asteroids and must be mined off the surface by the players or enemy ships. When floating in free space, they may be picked up by the enemy or the player. In the final game, only 1 crystal is needed to make a bomb, but in the original treatment, 4 crystals are required instead. The warrior enemies were initially 2 separate bad guys, the escort and miner ships. The fast escort ships don't use their weapons to mine asteroids and only shoot at the player spacecraft. Extra points were to be awarded if the player could shoot down every escort ship in an attack formation. The miner ships are slow, barge-like vessels that don't actively pursue the player, but just focus on mining crystals. In the final game, the warriors were given the ability to mine, effectively making the miner ships redundant. The biggest difference can be found with the Juggernaut itself, which includes an enemy warlord character that pilots the skull machine from the inside. The warlord is located inside an escape pod found in the skull's eye socket, which sounds like a reference to the iconic scene from the 1902 French silent film, A Trip to the Moon. To move around, the Juggernaut uses a crystal-based propulsion barrier that surrounds the circumference of the machine. John continues with his description. Motion is accomplished by exploding one of the barrier crystals, causing the Juggernaut to move in a direction opposite the location of the explosion. These movement explosions are occurring constantly, which makes it mandatory that the Juggernaut continues to consume crystals in order to sustain its energy and efficient movement. To capture the player's ship or acquire crystals, a short-range freeze ray shoots out of the skull's mouth, and immobilizes the desired object in a ring of energy, which is described as a crackling donut. The freeze ray then drops the crystals or the player's ship into the Juggernaut's mouth, causing a huge explosion as the jaw closes. Once the main Juggernaut body is completely destroyed by seeker bombs, the Juggernaut warlord launches the escape pod and tries to flee from the player to find another early developing Juggernaut body nearby. While not attached to the Juggernaut, the warlord can be destroyed by a single seeker bomb. The warlord is faster than the player's ship and has the ability to dodge an asteroid at the last moment, as he will try to lead a pursuer, a ship, or seeker bomb into the path of asteroids. Big bonus points are awarded to the player who can destroy a warlord. A subtle but interesting difference in the Juggernaut treatment is that asteroid collisions do cause damage to other objects, similar to games like Atari's Asteroids. I wonder if Sam's unconventional idea of having the rocks bounce off the player ship may have come at a later date. John's scenario of having a sentient skull attacking the player saved Sam's game from being cancelled, but now the crunch was on. The new goal was to complete the game by November 1982, just in time for the annual trade show held by the Amusement and Music Operators Association, better known as AMOA. This meant the deadline was less than 6 months away. With a game this ambitious in terms of scope, getting the development done that quickly wasn't going to be an easy task. Now that the design documents were complete, the race was on to assemble the software team. John Newcomer and Ken Lantz recognized that Noah had the leadership ability needed and asked him to take over Sam's duties as team lead.
It had been started and abandoned before I came in, and John brought it up as a possible thing for me to work on in like the first week or two that I was there at the company.
Noah realized the project was a great fit for him since he made a computer game in college with the similar theme of mining asteroids with combat scenarios. He agreed to take on the project and was allowed to make it his own, while Sam was more than relieved to have the managerial duties taken away so he could focus on writing code again.
Sam, because he'd been working on it before, for a while had kind of been heading it up, but he was really nice. I mean, he deferred to me, and I said, "Is this going to be awkward if I take over, your baby?" And he says, "Oh no." He was relieved to be able to do the coding stuff that he liked to do, and leave me to coordinate stuff and have to deal with the top brass there to keep him happy as we were late on projects and that sort of thing.
John had created a sketch of the Juggernaut, and temporary pixel art was made to see if the Williams hardware could handle drawing such a large sprite without frame rate drops. Unfortunately, the original artwork for the Juggernaut doesn't exist anymore, but apparently it looked like a badass skull in John's own words. By the time Noah had joined the team as the project lead, a second software engineer was already assigned to Juggernaut and working with Sam. His name is Rich Witt, and he would end up contributing a large amount of code to the game. Very little is known about Rich, and no interviews with him exist. As a matter of fact, his source files and comments in the leaked codebase are the first time anything written by him has been seen publicly. As more programmers were starting to join the project, source management became a big problem. In the case of Joust, nearly the entire main program was stored in one file, spanning over 8,100 lines of code. This made it difficult to maintain with other programmers, as Foots had to take their code and patch it into his main program source file. So for Juggernaut, it was decided that each team member should have their own self-contained module to work on specific parts of the game separately. It was now time to start focusing on creating the actual artwork for the game. At this juncture, John Newcomer realized that the title Juggernaut had to be replaced. The name itself didn't test well during market research because players didn't know what the word meant. One of the suggested replacements was Darkstar, and there's an unconfirmed rumor that a few marquees featuring this name were made, and one of them made it into the hands of a collector. The Juggernaut skull that John quickly sketched out in the brainstorming session needed to be replaced as well, since it was just a placeholder design. John understood that good eye-catching art was important in selling a product, so he helped hire an artist by the name of Jack Hager, who had just graduated from the Art Institute of Chicago. Jack was tasked with creating both the pixel and cabinet artwork, essentially producing the entire visual identity of the game and its cast of characters. In a previous interview, Jack recalls what it was like working at the company. My first real job, and I'm in this building with a bunch of college guys who aren't wearing shoes and are sleeping in sleeping bags in their offices. We all went and saw movies in the afternoon, and this was a real job. For Noah, it was the first time he had worked with a trained artist on a video game. In the early 80s, it was still common practice for programmers to be responsible for drawing the sprite art, doing their best to work around the strict limitations of the hardware.
The artists that we had, Jack Hager, working on Sinistar, having people who were specialized artists that had been trained in art school instead of what I had been doing in Milton Bradley in my job before that, where the programmers just would take a piece of graph paper and start coloring in the squares because that was about the resolution that we were able to handle. There really wasn't, art being done. And it was just a revelation to me that you could have a team of specialists and, to be organizing this team on Sinistar, the four of us that were doing the main code and Mike Metz doing the sound and, the artists and working with the, as I say, the hardware and mechanical engineers.
With more colors and higher resolution now possible, it was only logical to recruit talented artists that were willing to trade in their paint for pixels. It was either Jack or Noah that came up with the idea of combining the words sinister and star together to create the name Sinistar, but no one remembers for sure. What is certain is Noah's love for puns. As a chronic punster, Noah started putting the Sini prefix in everything whenever possible as an inside joke. Everyone else on the team would join in, and at the end of sleep-deprived 16-hour workdays, it seemed that any word with Sini in it was funny. Much like Rich, Noah also put his own sense of humor into the codebase as well, like this milkshake comment in the vibration routine for the Sinistar.
Bomb out with the new execution, how appropriate.
Yeah. It's funny because, I would do that stuff mostly to amuse myself, I guess, as I was, doing this stuff. And it's just really nice for me, all, 40 years later, having somebody tell me that they appreciated the jokes I put into the comments in Sinistar. It's amazing.
Well, I bet it must feel, as surreal it is for me to talk to you about this. I'm sure it feels the exact same way. It's like, I bet you never ever thought you'd be looking at this with someone.
To keep morale up and to encourage extra effort, Noah had a fresh supply of chocolate chip cookies on hand for the dev team. It's probably safe to assume that Sweets and Munchies helped influence the renaming of the Seeker bombs to Sinibombs. Jack Hager had the difficult task of designing all the objects in the game, but also creating a character who had to speak and feel alive to the player, all while using just 16 colors for the palette with sprite dimensions no bigger than 50 by 50 pixels. Regardless, Jack was able to create a grayscale gradient with the limited colors and utilize them for shading techniques that gives the sprites an impressive appearance and a sense of depth. This use of backlighting and shadows contrasts sharply with the often flat and two-dimensional pixel art found in other contemporary games. Before drawing the pixel art, Jack created a painting of the Sinistar where you can see the same dramatic lighting used in the final pixelated image. Having the light source placed beneath the Sinistar's face purposely gives our bad guy a dark, ominous vibe. Note how the Sinistar was intended to look a lot more shiny and metallic here, with what almost appears to be razor blades jutting out from the sides. According to Noah, Jack often showed up to work in a kimono-like robe with kanji characters on it. His appreciation of Japanese culture carried over into the design of the Sinistar as well, with the main inspiration of the Sinistar's demonic face taken from traditional masks worn by samurai. The 32 frames that make up the smooth rotation of the player ship is one of my favorite highlights from the Sinistar sprite art. Again, a stationary light source is taken into consideration, and only the left side of the spaceship stays lit while it rotates. The marquee, the monitor bezel, the control panel overlay, and the stenciled side art found on the various cabinet styles for Sinistar are again Jack's work. A lot of arcade cabinet artwork from this time period was often drastically different from the in-game art itself. Conversely, because they share the same artists, the Sinistar cabinet art matches up with the pixel art perfectly. though there is one exception which can be found in the marquee. We'll get back to that later in the video. Sinistar came out in 3 different types of cabinets, each of them having their own unique details and variations. These are the standard upright cabinet, the rare cockpit or sit-down cabinet that came with exclusive stereo sound, and finally, a handful of Sinistar machines use the very rare Duramold cabinet, made entirely out of high-impact molded plastic in the shape of a cylinder. Side note, I believe there was actually a 4th cabinet designed for Sinistar, but it never got past the prototype stage. This patent drawing of what appears to be a small cocktail cabinet is the only proof of its existence. The extensive amount of artwork required for each cabinet meant that several previous art renderings had to be reused. The painting of the Sinistar was redrawn and used as the instruction manual cover and one of the panels in the cockpit cabinet, while 3 frames of the Sinistar's lip sync animation showed up again in the Duramold bezel art. Meanwhile, back in the software department, Ken Lance asked software engineer Mike Metz to handle the game's audio. He was 22 at the time.
I really got into the real-time stuff and the graphics and image processing, so when I was looking for a job, I had a friend, Harry Klein, who worked there. And so interviewed, got a job right away. It was a great find. My wife did make me quit eventually because we used to, in the lobby, we had all these games and we'd have week-long tournaments. Literally would take a week with 2 players trying to kill each other in a video game, and I punched out a plate glass window and broke my hand. I was a little too wound up.
It was a really nice group of people. You know, Mike came from a big Italian family and would hold these huge parties. Too, I remember in particular because he would put us all to work cooking. That one of them, he did a bouillabaisse, and we were just cleaning fish and shelling, shrimp and things and throwing them in a pot. Another one, we made pasta fresh and brought a bunch of us into his apartment and had a pasta machine, was running us through and making strands of pasta, and he had hung clothesline all through the apartment. So we had all this pasta drying, and meanwhile he's opening up bottle after bottle of really nice Italian wine, and we're all getting drunk, and then all the dried pasta goes into the pot, and he was just a really great guy, and very fun in his own way. So we would party together, and everybody was in their 20s, and the people that I remember thinking of really old who were running the company were probably no more than 45 at the time. And now that I'm in my 60s, it puts it in a different perspective.
Just like with Ken, Mike also had previous experience with graphics programming and had even modified some of Ken's attract screen code from Joust to display the Sinistar marquee logo, that feature that ended up being removed from the final game, unfortunately due to space restrictions. Ken knew that he was asking a lot from Mike, since he was now responsible for not only creating the sound effects, but also digitizing the speech audio for the Sinistar and creating the sit-down cabinet's pioneering multi-channel audio system. But despite this tall order, Mike was a trooper and able to get the audio done on time for the AMOA Expo. Like with previous Williams games, much of the sound design in Sinistar is based off of sound effects borrowed from other software engineers. Mike created unusual sounds using new types of waveform shapes, with their pitch being controlled by super-fast, jaggy frequency patterns. Other experimental methods used to quickly design sounds include typing in random numbers for synthesizer parameter values and even manipulating corrupted data.
It's one of my favorite stories. The sound chip, being a separate chip, it had its own board and everything. And when Mike was working on sounds, he would power up the system.
Oh, yeah,
and
the corruption of the memory and everything.
Yeah, well, there'd be random garbage. And one day he just, I think by mistake, told it to play before he had said anything and get this really strange sound. And he started flipping the power off, flipping it on, hitting the button again. I remember sitting while he was doing that for at one point. The vast majority of them were useless. You'd get these kind of bah, 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 kind of repetitive noises mostly. But every once in a while, you'd get this weird, otherworldly thing, like the extra, when you won an extra ship, it goes kind of sound. That was just so distinctive. We realized, oh, this is perfect because it's going to break through all the other sounds. You're going to hear that and know that, okay, great, I've got that. It's really essential. Sometimes you're down to your last ship and you're fighting every moment, and you can't even spare to look up at the top of the screen to see, if you've got one. So hearing that sound lets you know that, okay, it's safe. If you get killed, the game's not over yet. And so he did that for a while. And I think after a day or two of doing that, his system wasn't working, and he went to the hardware guys and said, yeah, what's going on? And they're looking at us, God, this is so weird. This is all burnt out. And he described what he'd been doing. And the guy almost, had a fit, because he said, that's one of the worst things you could do with the hardware. When you turn it off, you should wait at least 10 minutes before you turn it on for it to cool off. And you were sending these spikes through the system. And of course it just died. We got, I think, 2 or 3 sounds that we used in the game that Williams then, their library of sounds, we had sounds that had been used in Robotron and Defender before that, and that the unique ones that came out of his doing that, I heard them for years later in Williams Arcade, and then their pinball games. You would occasionally hear one of the Sinistar sounds, 5 or 10 years later.
Mike explained to me that his favorite sound from the game is the player start cue, and with the multi-channel sound system in the sit-down cabinet, you can hear the sound quickly bouncing back and forth between the 2 sets of speakers.
So much sound at the time was da-dink, 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 and oh God, please, there was nothing musical about it. But, I thought the game was very, very hyped, and so you needed sort of a fast, line. That one was, I'm going to say that was more of an accident, trying other people's code, trying other stuff people had done before, and trying to find ways to, the 6802 was very, very small.
I noticed that, it's also using like this unusual squarish sine wave.
That credit is to Harry Klein. The kind of square wave, sine wave stuff was from a lot of the stuff he taught me, more efficient ways to get assembler code written.
No one at Williams had ever worked with multi-channel audio before, so Mike had to find a way to make the front and rear speakers work together while working with hardware that was originally made for just one channel of mono sound.
In the sit-down one, there's speakers behind you, and you're kind of in an enclosed booth. And so the reverb really gave you a feel of being in a echoey cockpit or something,
To create another channel of audio, a second soundboard was installed in the rear of the sit-down cabinet. Then, Mike created a slightly different sound ROM that produces an audio delay of only around 100 milliseconds. When played in unison with the other unmodified sound and speech board in the front, a stereo separation effect is produced that feels surprisingly immersive, especially with explosions. Even after all this work, there was still one thing missing. The Sinistar needed a voice. When he was offered the role of the Sinistar, radio personality John Newcomer already had a prolific career lending his voice to syndicated radio, local Chicago commercials, and even some narration for NFL films. He also found success from working with airliners after his company pioneered the use of in-flight music. This was not the first time Newcomer had worked with Williams Electronics. His voice can be heard in a promotional vinyl record from 1979 talking about the Gorgar pinball machine.
Gorgar is the first and only talking pinball game, given life and breath by Williams Electronics.
While Paul DeSalt did the speech processing for Gorgar, software engineer John Kotlarick was assigned the same task for Sinistar. We know this because John put his initials and a date inside the speech ROM data itself. Interestingly, the same date, May 25th, 1982, also appears to be the earliest one mentioned in the Sinistar codebase. I think it's plausible that Juggernaut officially started development on this date. Even though pre-recorded voiceover was not a new thing for video games, these early vocal performances were usually done by the programmers themselves or a friend or fellow employee of theirs.
Go for it! Oh no!
At Williams, Steve Ritchie had already provided voiceover for a few of his own pinball games, including Firepower and Black Knight.
The Black Knight will win again.
Years later, his voice would become even more famous after appearing in the video game Mortal Kombat.
Animality or animality, what do you want?
Animality.
Animality.
Feel the power of Shao Kahn.
Pre-recorded voiceover is yet another feature that Sinistar shares with Bosconian. With voice acting allegedly performed by Namco America president Hideyuki Nakajima, the digital audio heard in this game is uncompressed 4-bit PCM, and because of the super low bit and sampling rates, it doesn't sound very good.
Alarm! Battle station. Flagship sighted. Condition red.
The uncompressed data also takes up a lot of precious ROM space. Another early example of video game voiceover is the 1981 game Thief, but the dialogue doesn't match up with any specific character, it's just police radio chatter recorded on an analog cassette tape inside the cabinet that stops and starts abruptly during gameplay.
Car 9, chase. Pretty good playing.
Because of these facts, I believe John Doremus's portrayal of the Sinistar is the earliest example of a hired professional voice actor playing the role of a character specifically created for a new video game. I would also argue that Mike's use of CVSD encoding to compress the Sinistar speech is one of the first uses of digital compression for a video game audio asset, something we take for granted now in practically every video game released today.
Do you recall what the equipment was like for digitizing the reel to tape? I meant the tape audio to the encoder.
Boy, I should, because I did it. I sat for so many hours in that little office with the door closed so I wouldn't bug everybody. So we had a chip, a constant velocity slope. And I think the hardware guys just made a thing that would take it and you could set the sample size or the bit rate that you wanted to capture. And literally, you'd hit the play, you'd hit the button, you'd record this little digital thing that then you had to insert into the code. So very, very simple, basic setup. And that's what I'm saying, you had to do like 2 seconds at a time because that generates a lot of data, and the data is the one thing you don't want. And then you could toy with, you've just got a bunch of hex. You can toy with the hex, just write little code snippets to break it down, kind of rudimentary compression stuff.
Yeah.
How much of the clarity do you lose by literally taking off the resolution of the changes in the waves? If you have a sound wave that goes up, down, up, and you just cut off the down, which obviously saves a lot of bandwidth, how bad does it make it sound? And so there was, all this experimenting to just try to get it to even sound like a voice with the original tape is, very high resolution recording, but that's not what we ended up with, obviously.
The limited capacity of the speech chips meant that only 16 kilobytes can be used to store both the compressed audio as well as the small program that processes the speech data. Even after encoding, the total amount of audio that could fit was just under 8 seconds. These space restrictions meant that Mike couldn't digitize an entire sentence of dialogue and had to be very selective with which words to use. To put this into context, Gorgar has only 7 different words, while Sinistar barely manages to get away with 9 words, including the roar sound effect. In his office, Mike installed a 1936 radio cabinet to use as a speaker for his reel-to-reel tape player. He then meticulously messed around with the raw recordings of John Doremus's voice acting for several weeks. Out of the 20 to 30 minutes of recorded material, he had to pick out the most important phrases to be digitized for the speech board.
I am Sinistar. Coward. Run, live, hunger, beware.
To save on space, the chosen lines of dialogue were broken down into single words, and then during gameplay, John Kotlarik's speech processing routine plays back the separate words in the right order, depending on which phrase was selected. Instead of wasting space by recording the entire phrase, run, 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 it's much more efficient to just record the word run once and then have the computer repeat the audio clip.
We had this guy who worked there, another young kid, and he was just a hilarious guy. Everybody picked on him, and his name was Howard. When we got the recording for Run, Coward, everybody everybody said, "Run, Howard." I wanted to turn that into a Run, Howard, just on a quiet little back channel or something somehow, but couldn't do it.
Again, thanks to Paul Drury, we have access to an early original Sinistar script penned by John Newcomer. The script is broken down into 3 categories: sounds, words, and sample phrases. Knowing that space restrictions were a concern, John chose words that could be used repeatedly. All 3 lists contain unused lines of dialogue like, "I am the universe," "The universe is mine," "The Sinistar is the universe," "You hurt me," "I defeated you," "Fight the Sinistar," and the notably out-of-place C-spot run.
I didn't understand the C-spot run. How is that going to fit into the game design?
The original "I am the Sinistar" was later truncated to remove the definitive article, and the word "beware" is missing altogether. Interestingly, some of the phrases seem to serve as tutorial instructions or attract mode messages such as "Mine crystals, mortal," "You need crystals," "Cinibombs hurt," "You need Cinibombs," and "The Cinibombs hurt me." Finally, the lists of sounds at the top of the page include descriptions for 3 deleted utterances like an eerie and ghost-like moan, Steve Ritchie's laugh from Black Knight, and a satisfying sigh of relief after being built. The last remaining sound described here, the agonizing roar, has become one of the game's most memorable elements. Originally, John Doremus was asked to do the roar, but he wasn't able to produce anything usable. Noah recalls everyone gathering around in Mike's office and having a good laugh listening to the outtakes.
Funny because I have such a memory of the Tarzan, the long thing that Tarzan does. He had a lot of recordings of that. We just couldn't get that in.
So John Doremus did a Tarzan yell?
Oh yeah. Oh my God, thumping in the chest and all that stuff.
In addition to being the first game with proper voice acting and lip sync, the Sinistar roar might be the very first time video game developers took a pre-existing sound effect from a sound library and used it as a digitized audio asset. For decades, the original source of the roar was long forgotten. However, through sheer luck, I stumbled upon a clue that helped solve the mystery.
I managed to find the actual sound effect. It's from for the roar. It's a gorilla.
Really?
Yeah.
Not long before work commenced on the retargeting project, I came across a clip from the Twitch streamer Vinny Vinesauce while he was watching some retro TV commercials. My ears immediately perked up when out of nowhere I heard the Sinistar roar in a commercial featuring a gorilla destroying some luggage.
That's why American Tourister suitcases are reinforced with strong stainless steel frames.
How much do they pay that monkey to do that job? How do I get that job?
Sure, you may pay a little.
The fact that this commercial used the same sound effect and it had a copyright date of 1980 told me that the roar recording must have originated from a stock sound library and is actually older than the game itself. My previous experience with audio was very useful in this situation as I started looking through some common libraries to see if I could find a match. It wasn't long before I discovered a DeWolf sound library record from 1975 with various animal wildlife sounds, including a recording of a gorilla roaring twice. It is this exact recording that was used for the game, with one minor but important change. The volume of the roar is actually louder than the rest of the Sinistar dialogue, which makes the sound even more hair-raisingly scary. With the art and audio assets taken care of, let's finally take a look at how the main program for Sinistar was developed. As mentioned previously, the game's code is split up into modules. The order of these modules are based on who joined the project first. Naturally, the first one belongs to Sam Dicker and contains the core components of the game engine itself, like the multitasking operating system, joystick input, pixel art, graphics processing, and diagnostics.
The thing I was most proud of, I wrote kind of a really lightweight operating system that did non-preemptive multitasking and could handle lots of threads, maybe hundreds of threads of program, which was a lot back then. in Sinistar, all the different ships, the miners and stuff, do these complex sequences of operations where they'll find a planet, they'll shoot at it, they'll collect the crystals, and they'll fly the crystals over to where the Sinistar is being built, and then they'd go and they had all this behavior, but each of them was actually operating as if running its own thread, and that was, I think at that time that was pretty advanced, especially to be running on a such primitive hardware.
In terms of front-facing gameplay elements, this module contains routines for the scanner, the scrolling star field, and of course the player ship. Sam's scanner at the top of the screen is really important because it displays everything inside the entire in-game universe. It's able to do this because technically the scanner is the universe, as every single game entity exists first inside the scanner itself. As soon as an off-screen scanner object crosses into the smaller scanner border that surrounds the player's ship, it transitions into an on-screen object that the player can interact with. Again, Sam spent a considerable amount of time perfecting a sophisticated and optimized multitasking operating system that uses a linked list architecture as its basis. This operating system allows the slow 8-bit 6809 CPU to handle the heavy lifting required for keeping track of the dozens of objects in the game while still maintaining 60 frames per second as much as possible. Being efficient with code and trying to optimize whenever feasible was a high priority for the entire team since space and processing power was so limited.
That was a huge part of the job, was optimizing the assembler. You would look at everything and try to optimize the code by hand to get less memory, less clock cycles. And so, when you do things like division, it's very, very expensive from the CPU standpoint. And so Harry, he'd always take my code. So I'd optimize it, and I'm like, he's not going to get this better and faster. He would take this thing that took, 30, 40, 50 clock cycles and get it down to 10.
The engineers realized that additional RAM was needed for quick access to the large Sinistar sprite and the special animation effect for the Sinibombs.
As the Sinistar is being built, he's actually being built into that static RAM, so the blitters can go bam. As a piece gets built, they blit it onto that static RAM, and when he comes on the screen, they blit it from the static RAM rather than the pieces in ROM. It was an efficiency sort of thing because poor little CPUs just don't run as fast as your cell phones. So you had to cheat. That was an operative term that you'll hear a lot of. You hear some of the old programmers is cheat. I gotta cheat to get cycles out. I gotta cheat to do this.
To accommodate for this hardware change, the number of ROM chips were reduced from 12 to 11. This meant that instead of working with 48 kilobytes of free space like Joust, the main program for Sinistar had only 44 kilobytes available. However, this too is slightly inaccurate, as this number also includes the whopping 4 kilobytes reserved exclusively for the separate diagnostic ROM chip.
I don't remember how we managed to organize all the work. It was so long ago, and who figured out how we would divvy it up. I mean, I actually, all the source code for that leaked a couple of years ago. And so it was fun going back and looking at the software that I wrote so long ago and saying,
I remember that bit.
Yeah, exactly. Or I don't remember writing that. Where did that come from?
One of the most incredible finds in Sam's module is this unused routine called Tail. It creates a thruster flame special effect behind the player ship and was eventually removed from the game due to these space restrictions. No one knew about the existence of this code until 2 years after the Sinistar codebase had been uploaded online. Frankly, the fact that this source file survived all this time is an absolute miracle, and thanks to the Retargeting project, the effect was properly re-implemented back into the game just last year. In early versions of Sinistar, the procedurally generated tail was always visible, and later on, changes were made to the player ship that caused the flames to light up only when the player moved the joystick. The random colors that make up this effect are very reminiscent to Defender's own player ship thruster graphic. It's unclear when the effect was removed during development, but since it wasn't seen at the AMOA show, it must have been deleted before November 1982 at the latest. This special effect must have been the reason why Jack Hager drew flames behind the player ship on the marquee. It's the only detail from his cabinet artwork that differs from the raster graphics in the final game. Rich's module is next. If you think of Sam's module as the game's universe, then Rich's code represents the inhabitants that live in it. All of the intelligence, animation, and pathfinding routines for each type of enemy are located in his module. He contributed a lot of code to the gameplay logic and laid down the groundwork for the Sinibombs, the object collision handling, and the warp transition sequence in between each zone. Because of the separate modules, small edits like these appear throughout the entire codebase, as everyone occasionally had to hop onto another team member's workstation and put in some additional instructions. Each member of the Sinistar team has their own unique writing style, and this can help out with understanding which lines of code are from whom. From the styling of the comments, we can determine that some of Sam's code exists in Rich's module and was expanded upon afterwards. Likewise, some files from Sam's module have later additions from Rich. Inside the preserved codebase, we now have the original debug code Rich and Sam wrote, including this bar graph that displays several gameplay variables like the current playtime and the number of enemies on screen. One of Rich's most useful and convenient debug features is the ability to fill up on Sinibombs by tapping the rarely used Player 2 button. Once the bomb count reaches 20, a never-before-seen message appears saying, "Captain, our bomb bay is full," which sounds like something Scotty or Spock would say. This debug routine can also be reconfigured so that after reaching the maximum number of bombs, the Player 2 button can then be used to instantly add a Sinistar piece. Most of the time, the code Rich wrote is juxtaposed by verbose comments that explain what's going on, but sometimes there were routines of his where the comments were purposely missing. This section of code here was really confusing to me at first. When I first enabled it, I thought something went wrong and that one of the planetoid sprites got corrupted in the process. But after a closer inspection, I realized what had happened. The code was for an Easter egg, and it had deliberately drawn over the sprite with the name Wit in pixels. I've since learned that Rich has this amusing tendency to hide his name in places you wouldn't expect. His first and last name are actually embedded inside one of the game's anti-piracy routines, and you can see this for yourself by viewing the contents of ROM number 6 in a hex editor. Rich's module also contains a lot of miscellaneous garbage files that gives us extra info regarding the timeline of events during development. One file contains a list of to-dos for March 1983, less than a month before the final release date. A couple of files that are unrelated to Sinistar can be found here as well. It turns out Rich was starting preliminary work on a mysterious project for Williams as development for Sinistar was wrapping up, but we'll save that story for later. The third module belongs to Noah Falstein.
Because I was the project leader and also doing a lot of the design stuff, I didn't have as much time for coding as the other guys, but I really enjoyed figuring out the AI in Sinistar.
As team lead, he was responsible not only for the project's completion, but also for the final tuning of the game's difficulty and pacing, ensuring that they met the needs of Williams' management. In terms of software, his contributions include the logic for the crystals and the planetoids, as well as additional enemy intelligence routines so the bad guys can make quick decisions on the fly. He also further elaborated on the game's bouncy collisions by adding a vibrating bounce routine into the mix. This forces the planetoids to shake violently when hit with weaponry. It's also what allows the rocks to toss crystals out into space. Each object that vibrates uses their own internal Richter scale. For the planetoids, this value increases with every player shot, and once the maximum value has been exceeded, the planetoid then explodes in a spectacular fashion. The planetoids share a lot in common with the worker and warrior enemies in that they have their own hidden intelligence programming, and their population numbers can be adjusted as the game progresses. One of the biggest problems Noah had was figuring out an efficient way to have the plethora of enemy ships act together and appear as if they were thinking and performing evasive maneuvers. The workers and warriors need to interact with the multitude of various floating objects, as well as quickly switching between different objectives during gameplay, such as intercepting the player or scooping up a crystal. After trying to come up with a solution for weeks, Noah had an epiphany. Instead of letting each enemy automatically assign themselves a task like mining an asteroid, let the asteroid itself call out to the nearby enemies in space. This caller-callee system allows the assortment of enemies to work together and let the current on-screen objects dictate how they behave. The farther away the caller is from a callee, the lower priority it has, and vice versa. Rich was able to expand upon this idea by implementing the caller-callee logic among the enemies themselves, which gives the warriors the ability to form squadrons and let the workers swarm together and dive in to intercept the player's bombs.
It's like, I remember one of the things I was proud of is that the warriors would actually try and shoot down your Sinibombs before they hit the Sinistar. And I think originally that was so good that you just couldn't kill the Sinistar, and we actually had to screw with their aim a little bit because they were just too accurate. Or the fact that when the Sinistar is being built, you actually have a warrior and two workers who are teamed together to go to an asteroid and make it vibrate and pick up the crystals and bring them back to the Sinistar. And you can sort of see that happen on the screen, but they're also programmed that when you as the player get close to them, they give up mining crystals and attack you or run away, depending on whether they're a warrior or worker. And so the very efficiency of the AI meant that you actually didn't get to, the only time you would really see what it was doing is if you kind of knew what it was supposed to do, and you could see the little dots moving on the radar screen and figure out what each of these different characters was thinking at the time. And this was all on a 1 megahertz processor too. I mean, the thing that amazes me is how incredibly slow it was compared to even the simplest computers we use today, and yet we were able to get all this stuff happening on the screen.
If you haven't already noticed from the previous screenshots of the game's source code, nearly all the symbols and labels in the codebase are very short and rarely exceed 7 characters. The dev team realized that the symbol table size for their assembler was terribly inadequate. This meant that in order for everything to fit into the table, each symbol or label had to be truncated or abbreviated. To make matters worse, there was also no linker utility available to automatically match up with everyone's symbols and combine the modules together. To work around this, whenever someone had to reference code from the next module down the line, a blank space was set up ahead of time to let the next engineer hook onto these stubs from outside their module. These problems also meant that everyone's symbol library had to match up, otherwise trying to build the game results in assembler errors. Yet another workaround was needed, so each programmer had to generate their own lists of all the symbols, labels, and equates referenced inside their module. While working on restoring the codebase, I found these symbol listings to be worth their weight in gold, as they greatly helped with reducing a lot of the guesswork and time spent on the project. Another issue involved a hardware bug with the blitter chip responsible for graphics processing. This forced any game code related to graphics to require extra instructions as a fix. With the limited ROM space, this was not an ideal solution.
The blitter chip, we had the high-speed chips to push stuff out onto the screen. Those were all proprietary tricks that Williams used. And Sinistar, one of the things that was really central to it is that it was the largest single animated character that had ever been, put on a game screen before, because the blitter was able to do it, but it was really pushing everything right to the limits to be able to do that stuff. At one point, the CEO of the company came in and said, well, what if you made the Sinistar smaller and did these other things? And I remember we all kind of gasped because we had, just been sweating bullets just to make it as big as it possibly could. And, happily he didn't insist on our changing it, but that would have been really a tragedy for us to give up on all the work we did just to make that big, scary looking head as imposing as possible.
To make the Sinistar sprite appear that it was speaking, some type of lip sync animation was required.
I think it was Sam who had the brilliant idea that we were in these rooms with whiteboards, and Sam tried something, and it sounded crazy, but we gave it a try, where he wrote the text for what Sinistar would say on the whiteboard. Then he got up and put his face next to the whiteboard and took one of the markers and essentially held it on his chin. So as he opened and closed his mouth, he would say, beware, I live, and it would wiggle. And he would move his head down at a constant rate as best he could, looking at the words, beware, I live. And it created a kind of graph of how his chin moved as the words were said. And then he went through looking at these little squiggly lines on the whiteboard and roughly digitized them to correspond. And we were just shocked when we first saw the results, because it was just great. It went from just this kind of random flapping. It was true, actually, I think, even of cartoons of that era. If you watch them, a lot of the characters, their mouths are moving, but it has nothing to do with the actual words or, the phonemes that they're saying. And we were, I think, the first ones to do that, because it was this weird low-tech way to make a very sort of high-tech visual effect.
Beware, I live. I am Sinistar. I hunger. Beware, coward. Run, coward. Run, run, run. I hunger, coward.
As with any game's development, some memorable bugs and glitches that cropped up produced unintentionally humorous results. One such bug was so funny to everyone in the software department that it nearly lost them a whole day of productivity. A mistake in one of the modules had replaced the player's weapons with warrior enemies instead. Everyone was entertained by the silly bug, but also amazed that Sam's operating system can handle the growing number of enemies on screen without slowdown. Noah told me that they even briefly discussed adding it as a feature at some point, but realized that was a dumb idea for many reasons. Before we go any further with software, let's discuss one of the game's most important pieces of hardware. While all three Sinistar cabinets are quite different from each other, one of the few things they do share in common are the controls. The glowing lights underneath the colorful translucent push buttons are a nice touch. Note that the button layout is ambidextrous and allows players to use either hand with the newly designed 49-way digital joystick, the first of its kind.
My boss, Ken Lance, who was doing that 49-way joystick, and I remember him being really excited about the idea and talking to me about it. And it's one of the things that I miss about that era is that we actually could design the way the controls worked. So that's why Defender and Sinistar had radically different control panels, for example, in that it was all within our creative control to change the way the controls worked. And even now today, all these years later, you're kind of stuck with standard controllers and having to work within their limitations.
Originally, the player ship was controlled by an off-the-shelf analog joystick that was often prone to breaking. Previous machines that used analog sticks, like some of Atari's games, were notorious in the industry for their high failure rates. Everyone knew the analog controls simply couldn't handle a harsh arcade environment, and thus Ken Lance had to coordinate with the hardware engineers on designing a replacement. The need for a reliable joystick started becoming a concern even before the development of Sinistar, since all of the joysticks from Williams' previous games used leaf switches. These components are also used for the push buttons in the control panel, so they are fairly reliable, but after so many contacts, they either wear out or require readjustment. This was especially a problem for the Wiko joysticks used in Robotron. The answer to this problem was to replace the mechanical leaf switches with slotted optical switches instead. These work by emitting an infrared light beam from one side of the slot into a photodetector on the other side. By using sliding plastic interrupters to block the beam in the slot, it triggers the switch without making physical contact, therefore reducing the failure rate. To further make the new joystick design even more durable, a thick metal collar was added to the mounting plate that attaches to the control panel. This collar actually sticks through the hole of the wooden panel and allows the joystick to withstand excessive player abuse, such as kids grabbing the ball top and rocking the cabinet back and forth with it. By the time Juggernaut had turned into Sinistar, an 8-way digital joystick was already in production and tested well in the field. However, this new durable design only solved part of the problem. Because this new joystick was digital, it could only tell when a switch was either on or off, and using just 4 optical switches meant it can only detect up to 8 directions, a far cry from the input positions required to pilot the player ship. How can you make a digital joystick detect even the most subtle input from the player? Ken Lance recalls how the solution for the analog stick replacement dawned upon him. We were sitting in an engineering meeting discussing how unfeasible an analog joystick was when I realized, in an instant, a minor reorganization of the components and operation of the 8-way joystick could produce a 49-way output. Long story short, we made some prototypes, Noah and Sam produced input code for it, and we set up 2 machines side by side, one with the analog joystick, one with the 49-way joystick. I invited people on the staff to come and play the games. In less than an hour, as software department manager, when I heard people arguing which one was better, I knew we had a viable product.
It didn't matter which one was better. One was robust and could survive, while the other one was not viable.
During active gameplay, there was no way anyone could discern 49 positions. It felt analog. From that moment forward, all subsequent development used the 49-way. As Sam, Rich, and Noah endured 60 to 80-hour work weeks to get Sinistar ready, it soon became apparent that one more team member was needed if they were to meet the deadline on time. The 3 of them were already tackling the workload of coding the core program. There wasn't enough time for them to work on the other important stuff that was missing, like the attract mode, the status screen that displays in between turns, the high score screens, or even explosion effects. This is where Bob Michael joins the story. Bob, better known nowadays as RJ, was both a programmer and an artist from the south side of Chicago. He thought that working on video games was the best way to combine his 2 talents together, and he wanted to work at Williams since he felt they produced the best games. RJ made several failed attempts at trying to get a job there before realizing he needed to contact someone inside the company first to improve his chances.
Finally, in desperation, when I decided that I couldn't get through the recruitment process, I needed to talk to people directly. And I thought if I could talk to the engineers directly, I might be able to talk my way in. So I went to the receptionist of the company and bribed her with a date to get a copy of the company's phone. I mean, she was a pleasant enough person, but I bribed her with the fanciest date we could imagine taking her out on. And we did, in fact, go out on a real fancy date downtown with a really deluxe dinner. And we went to the Symphony. We saw Symphony that evening. It was a really good date. It really was. It was a lot of fun. But I did. I bribed this woman with a date to get a copy of the phone list and then started calling people one by one. And by the time I got down to the F's, I found this fellow named Noah Falstein who had some mercy and gave me a job at Williams on his project.
It was RJ's first video game gig, the first of many that soon followed.
We had this programmer, Robert Michael. He's just a hilarious character, and he was always trying to bait everybody. You know, you'd hear his laughter throughout the entire building all the time.
I do. I mean, we talk about it a lot because that was his break to get into the games industry, and he subsequently helped me get into first the 3DO company and then Google, both of which were, great opportunities for me. But we ended up, working with each other in various ways after that. So in his case, it was a lot more of a specific. Me hiring him. So I think I had to push Ken, the boss of our whole group, was really a little nervous about RJ because he had just come back from almost a year of traveling all the way around the world. He spent a bunch of time in Soviet Russia, for example. It was a really tense time to be an American to be traveling across the Soviet Union. And yeah, he did. I mean, RJ is a risk taker. I mean, he does all sorts of crazy stuff. But I just saw something in him that I thought, he really has passion and intensity on this stuff, and pushed him, I think, over one or two other people that had a little more directly relevant experience, but just didn't seem to be at the same caliber.
As the final programmer to join the team, RJ's module became the fourth and last one added to the game. Because of this, he was responsible for gathering all the assembled binary data from each module and burning it onto the ROM chips, also known as PROMs. Right from the get-go, RJ was eager to bring meaningful contributions to the project.
RJ, purely out of a desire to impress us, shortly after he was hired, basically worked about 48 hours straight, and we didn't realize it until the second day we were having lunch, and he started nodding off in the middle of lunch, and I said, "Are you okay? Are you feeling ill?" And he was really embarrassed. He just came clean. He said, "Yeah, I've been sleeping in the office because I wanted to get this ready in time for," he was working on the special effects for the explosions that we had, and he wanted those in before the next show that we were, hoping we would have it in. But we told him, it's okay, you're new. If you don't get it in there, we'll just go without it. But he really wanted to get that stuff in there.
The loud nature of messing around with the Sinistar speech required Mike Metz to work in the evenings when most of the Williams engineers had left for the day. During some nights, RJ and Mike made funny voice recordings and digitized them to make the Sinistar say silly things.
And some of the stuff was really, I don't know. There's a lot of tape sitting on the floor, is all I'll say.
RJ often jokes that he thinks the roar in the final game is actually him from one of these outtakes.
And the script was there, so we recorded me goofing around with the script, and now it's not clear anymore. It never was clear, as far as I know, exactly how much of the stuff in the game is that voice actor and how much of it is Mike and me at 11 o'clock at night in his office goofing around.
In 2019, a previously unknown promotional video for Williams was discovered in the archives of legendary pinball designer Steve Kordak. The slate at the beginning of the video is dated November 12, 1982, 6 days before the AMOA show. Hosted by two talking arcade cabinets, the bizarre video is obviously aimed for distributors and operators, touting how successful Williams has been with Defender and Joust.
And it's those innovations that make us what we are.
Innovations? With all the games out here, I wouldn't think there are any innovations left. Can they keep doing it, Defender?
Hey, come here, kid. I want you to see something. Talk about innovations. Take a look at your new brother.
Williams Electronics dares you to enter the game of tomorrow, to face the most sinister threat man has ever encountered, to be challenged to the very roots of your soul, to meet a force so powerful, so omnipotent, as to be virtually unconquerable. Williams Electronics dares you to climb into your interceptor, to hyperspeed into the outer limits of space, and meet face to face with Sinistar. Your future is today with Williams Electronics. We invite you to hyperspeed to success with us and join the growing numbers, profiting from the most successful line of video games in the industry. Williams Electronics.
This is the oldest footage known to exist of Sinistar. It's definitely from a build that's even more incomplete than the AMOA prototype, which is the earliest version of the game that's been preserved. With this gameplay video, we can deduce several things. At this point, the intelligence routine for the Sinistar was very basic and didn't do anything too special other than floating around and perpetually chomping. Noah remembers that they had to turn off the player collisions specifically for this video because the Sinistar couldn't stay on screen long enough for the camera. Another thing that's noticeable here is the lack of in-game explosion effects. You can't have a space shooter without cool explosions, and it was up to RJ to come up with something that looked even better than Defender. Since the killing routine for the Sinistar was in Rich's module, he had to work closely with RJ to make the explosion code work with the game logic. With no flashy particle effects to celebrate the player's victory, the death sequence for the Sinistar appears rather uneventful, which goes to show how much these new effects improved the visuals for the game. At the end of the video, there's an explosion graphic I have never seen before. I could be wrong, but it kind of looks like an early version of the player explosion particle effects. I think it's plausible this could be footage of one of RJ's preliminary special effects. RJ was also the coder behind the status page screen that informs the player with the current number of bombs and cine pieces. Once the Sinistar is built, this same screen gives us a clear view of the menacing villain, taunting the player with the iconic phrase, "Beware, I live." This feature was added late in development, right before AMOA, because the team realized it was difficult to see the lip sync animation during gameplay. Rich and RJ continued to collaborate together on the game's attract mode. When the machine is not in use, the game program switches into attract mode and demonstrates gameplay to potential customers passing by, while also displaying the high score tables and title screen. With the very limited ROM space remaining, they needed to figure out an efficient way to make the player ship automatically move on its own. In order to get this to work, RJ and Rich reused enemy intelligence routines and gave the demo player ship the same mining logic as a warrior. By using the color collie system mentioned previously, the planetoids and crystals can now call out to the warrior in player's clothing, while the retrofitted warrior mining behavior forces the fake player ship to shoot at nearby asteroids and then intercept the crystals that come out. Then the fake ship is called by the Sinistar itself and proceeds to drop some Sinibombs before the attract mode timer runs out. One of the biggest points of contention during development was the game's now infamous difficulty.
I remember so many discussions, and once again, I didn't write any of those algorithms. I was working on sound stuff, but the gameplay was a huge discussion constantly. Are we boning people? Are we going to screw them? Are they going to not drop another quarter?
Thanks to Defender, Joust, and Robotron, Williams already had an established catalog of tough games, so it was intentional for Sinistar to continue with this trend. The dev team felt it was important for the game to be balanced, yet challenging, but not too much so that it didn't feel like a ripoff to the player. Otherwise, if Sinistar was too easy, players could spend too much time on the machine, which meant less quarters in the coin box.
When I got there, the company had been, making video games for a while. It was all relatively new, but they had a lot of traditions and things that they'd worked out, and all of their machines, if you open up the coin door, there was a button you could press, and the arcade operators could adjust the difficulty on I think it was a scale of 1 to 10 or 0 to 9. And it was kind of known that we were going to need to be able to do that. So right from the beginning, we were looking at ways of, changing the difficulty of the game. And it was a combination of wanting to keep it simple so that, we could do something relatively easy, but also we didn't want to break anything by having 5 or 6 different variables change. And it turned out that at difficulty 7, the interaction of all the different things we changed would somehow cause a bug to happen.
After listening to concerns from arcade operators, Williams' management had requested that Sinistar have an average playtime of 2 minutes, but testing out in the field showed that average was actually closer to 3 minutes. Noah needed to find a way to shave a whole minute off without messing up the game's tuning. He realized the quickest and easiest fix was to increase the bonus points required for an extra ship.
Having the extra ships be, more rare and having, enemies be a little bit more accurate. I think the Sinistar builds significantly faster as you ramp up the difficulty. Just a few things that we knew wouldn't really break the bank that way, and we're sort of built into it.
Again, we are extremely lucky to have yet another unused file inside Sam's module that provides us with a definitive answer. As we can see here, the original value was set to 5,000 points, but in the final game, the default value is 30,000 points. This drastic bump makes it very difficult to quickly rack up bonus lives in Sinistar, unlike Robotron or Joust. Regardless, the enemy populations for the Deadly Warriors are still very intense, and I can confirm that the AMOA build is actually slightly tougher than the final game. By comparing the two enemy population tables, we can see that 6 warriors are loaded into the second zone, as opposed to the 3 warriors that show up in the final build. As time progresses, the population numbers can either increase or decrease depending on the difficulty rate assigned to them. There are 4 different waves or levels that the player can reach after the first initial zone. These zone names correspond with the current populations inside the level, so Worker Zone contains more workers, and Warrior Zone obviously has extra warriors. Meanwhile, the Planetoid Zone has tons of rocks, while the Void Zone is, well, devoid of them. The game's final tuning has the difficulty ramp up immediately after the first zone, further reinforcing that 2-minute playtime window. Sam has mentioned in a previous interview how the time crunch during development prevented them from finessing the game even more.
We didn't have a testing department. And so even though there were a lot of guys on the team that were working on that project, you start to lose your objectivity because you're so used to playing it, and something that's hard to somebody who's just playing it for the first time is a piece of cake for you. And so that's why you go to the test locations, because then you go there and you watch people play it, and you can look at their body language and their expressions on whether or not it's too hard, because sometimes they want it to be challenging. It can be challenging in a good way. So where that line is a very tough line, and you really need the direct testing to determine where that line is. And they didn't have enough time to do proper testing like that. And the other problem is the economics of the coin box. Okay? I mean, this was something that was ingrained to all of us. For the game to sell, you need to make X amount of dollars a week. And Sinistar still had the problem of, this is one of the reasons why I made Joust a 2-player simultaneous game. Well, now when you're back to a single-player game, now you can only make it a quarter at a time. And if you made it too easy, you were screwed, because then somebody's going to play the game for 2 hours, and trying to get that balance of what gets you the right combination of challenge to the player, but yet fills the cash box up correctly so you get the earnings that you need to justify a sale, that's your real world problem too. So you had to balance those two things, and it takes time. And when you're under time pressure like that, you don't get that.
The sudden jump in progression to meet the demands of arcade operators, plus the change from 5,000 to 30,000 points for bonus ships, and the lack of time for fine-tuning are the reasons why Sinistar has garnered such a reputation for being a difficult arcade title. In the mid-90s, RJ claimed that at some point during development, he burned his own set of Sinistar ROMs containing the original perfect difficulty tuning. But unfortunately, this ROM set was later misplaced and hasn't turned up since. Soon after RJ's explosions were starting to take shape, the game's level of polish increased with the inclusion of the high score entry table and the status screen. As storage space continued to decrease, non-essential features were now on the chopping block to make room for more critical code.
You always had to be super careful about how much room you were using to fit all the code in, either on the ROMs or in the RAM on the systems, or there are all these limitations. Or when I was doing home games, you also had to worry about the number of discs that it was shipping on, because that got bigger and bigger as you were trying to have to tell people to take floppy disk number 5 out and put number 6 in now. And It was a real pain.
Unfortunately, the first deleted part of the game would be Sam's thruster effect. More technical interfaces, like diagnostic tests, game adjustment settings, and bookkeeping stats were implemented at last, making Sinistar feel even more like a shippable product. It had been 6 months of hard work, and the team had succeeded in transforming Sam's game engine into an exhilarating arcade title. Unfortunately, despite the team's best efforts, some of the game's intended features and bug fixes were not going to make it in time for the trade show. AMOA was really important as it was one of the 2 biggest shows in the coin-op industry, and it was where most of the company's sales and pre-orders were made. The software team had no choice but to have the game shown in its prototype state.
And that was where all the people who made video games would get together to show off the games to all the people who were in the sales force and basically making the decisions about what orders to put in for how many copies of each game from each of the manufacturers. And it was all very competitive and very, very different than the way trade shows are today. It was incredibly sexist for one thing, just hordes of women in really skimpy clothes who were always, showing stuff off, and the guys smoking cigars, on the show floor. And it was, a very different era back then.
One of the biggest omissions in the build for the AMOA show is the death sequence when the player collides with the active Sinistar. As described in the Juggernaut design documents, a freeze ray was supposed to shoot out of the skull's mouth and immobilize the player's ship. This was simplified in the final game so that when the player touches the Sinistar, the controls are immediately disabled while the ship violently spins around the Sinistar's mouth before being devoured. But in the AMOA build, the player just instantly explodes upon collision. The sense of helplessness before dying is lost, and it doesn't feel as scary or impactful as a result. RJ was disappointed to see that his Sinistar explosion didn't appear as it should, with the Sinistar often sliding off screen, preventing the player from witnessing the psychedelic particle effects. On November 18, 1982, the first Sinistar cabinets were set up at the Hyatt Regency Hotel in downtown Chicago, placed alongside Joust and Moon Patrol machines at the Williams Electronics booth. Other than the promotional video produced for AMOA, there was no publicity or advertisements for the game leading up to its unveiling. From what I can gather, the first impression of Sinistar was not terrible, but it didn't leave much of an impact at the show. What did make headlines were new titles like Pole Position and a game from Sega which wowed people with its use of a new tech called Laserdisc. Even the staged birth of Baby Pac-Man seemed like it got more attention with the press. But to attendees at the show, the debut of Sinistar confirmed that Williams were returning to form with space shooters, and that the prototype had potential to become an even better game. As a result, Sinistar reportedly gained more pre-orders from arcade operators than Joust. There is evidence that the AMOA prototype build was also sent out to a few test locations in Chicago and throughout the country, so real arcade customers could playtest Sinistar and provide feedback to further improve the game.
Tokens Game World is proud to announce that they've been named as Colorado Springs' first prototype test center for new video games. That means when you come to Tokens, you'll be getting the latest and the best new video games.
After the final version of the game was released, the prototype build of Sinistar was lost for over a decade. It was around 1998 when the build was recovered, but its origins weren't completely understood yet. Collectors wondered if this was the perfect version of the game RJ previously talked about, but as the ROM set got around, it soon became obvious that it was the missing build from AMOA. The dev team were determined to have a much better game ready for the next big Chicago trade show, the Amusement Operators Expo, or AOE. The new deadline was March 25, 1983, 4 months away. This was it. The game had to be completed no matter what. Everyone in the software department helped out in some way to get the game out the door, checking for crash bugs or glitches that could cause issues down the road. In the source code for the high score table, RJ's comments lists everyone's full name next to the initials, so we now know who's who. During this time, RJ was tasked with adding an interface that allows an operator to enter a custom message for displaying during a track mode. Unfortunately, in order for the new feature to fit on the PROM chips, another non-critical chunk of code was needed to be removed, resulting in the late deletion of Mike Metz's title screen from RJ's module. As seen in trade magazines during this period, bootlegging and piracy was still an ongoing issue, so Williams wanted to protect themselves in case anyone made a copy of their code. To achieve this, the dev team implemented multiple copyright protection routines that deliberately corrupt the game if any of the copyright strings in the ROM are messed up. Another anti-piracy routine displays the company's name on screen if the player enters a specific sequence of button presses. This so-called court check was made so that if anyone was producing Sinistar bootlegs, someone from Williams' litigation team could input this complicated code and make the bootleg display the words Williams Electronics, thus proving the forgery, preferably in a courtroom setting. In a time where software engineers were rarely credited for their work, the dev team made the bold move to include their names inside the court check routine by adding a secret door that was difficult to trigger repeatedly. In these interview clips from the mid-90s, RJ elaborates on how the code was hidden.
The fellow who was in charge of that decision-making process, Noah Falstein, decided he was nervous that we'd get in a lot of trouble, too much trouble, for putting an Easter egg in. So he buried the thing so deep down that I can't even remember this complex series of things that you have to do to get it to show up. Guaranteed no one ever found it.
For those that are interested, here are the steps to trigger the Easter egg. The Easter egg routine was inserted into the button handling code inside Rich's module, and then at the last minute, the original button code was secretly swapped with the newer source file. As one of the last major edits to Rich's module, Sam added the much-needed death spin and biting animation for the now famous player death sequence. In another video clip, RJ has spoken about a peculiar bug involving this sequence that has gone on to become an urban legend of sorts.
It turns out that while you're in that configuration where you're spinning around in the mouth but not quite dead yet, one of the warrior guys can come in and shoot you right then and kill you right then. And then the Sinistar kills you and you die twice, which it's really rare. It's extremely rare that it would happen because most of the time the warriors, I believe in fact the warriors will not kill you when the Sinistar has you in its death grip already. But if one of their previous shots is still floating around in space, as they sometimes do, one of those can kill you. I think that's the way it worked. And the really interesting, that was a bug and that was a drag because of course every once in a while consumers would lose 2 lives instead of just 1, which they really hated. The kids, those kids, found out that if you only had 1 life left and you got into that death grip where it was about to destroy you, and then the warrior shot came and killed you, the warrior shot would reduce your lives to 0, and then the Sinistar would kill you, which would reduce your number of lives left to -1. And in the computer world, -1 is also a really big number. And all of a sudden, you'd have 255 lives left. And Lord knows how the kids would find these things. But I knew kids that could show me this in an arcade. They go up and say, look at this. And all of a sudden, they have 255 lives. And man, you can play for a long time on Sinistar. You've got 255 ships left, boy.
Some people have claimed to have pulled this off, but after conducting my own experiments, I can confirm that what he is describing in the video is impossible to do. As seen here, collisions are purposely disabled when the player is caught so that this situation doesn't happen. I believe what RJ is actually referring to is this bug that Rich describes in his March to-do list, which is already a known documented glitch found exclusively in the AMOA build. Inside the game's adjustment screen, the points required for a bonus ship can be set to 0. As soon as the player scores a single point, the game soft locks and draws a ton of ship icons next to the score. Upon restarting the machine and looking at the bookkeeping stats, we can see that the player was awarded 255 free lives during the last turn. In the final weeks leading up to the AOE show, The 4 engineers continued to isolate the core program's bugs and apply patches to fix them. Additional ROM space was nearly non-existent at this point, and in one instance, Rich was forced to overwrite one of the copyright strings to insert more code. Noah had to do the same thing and ended up using some extra space found in the diagnostic ROM for a player ship fix. By this point, the game had gone through thousands of iterations to make sure it was good as it could be. The stress was finally getting to everyone, and as development was coming to a close, RJ wrote an email addressed to Sam, Rich, and Noah, which somehow made it into the preserved codebase. In the letter, RJ describes the crunch and his feelings at the time, complete with his ironic humor.
Crunch has been around since those early days. I remember having some demos, where I had to stay up all night and basically push together a couple of chairs and somehow managed to sleep on, I guess, sitting in one chair with another chair with my legs propped up on it. I've told other people this story that one point I had to work pretty much all night. And in the next office over, I think his name was Kerry Kolker, 5 or 6 o'clock, about the time people would normally go home. But, I heard him start he had an early pinball thing that was going through a burnout test where it would go through every single relay in the whole thing and then repeat. So it would go dunk-a-da, dunk-a-da, dunk, pop, 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 beep, 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 pop-a-da, pop-a-da, dunk, 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 over and over and over again. And I heard him start to do this, and I thought, all right, I'll just ignore it. And I thought, I'm going to be here all night. He's probably set it to run until the next morning, and then he'll see if anything happens. So I went over and knocked on the door, and he'd already left and locked his door. So that whole night, I had to try and somehow work until like 3 a.m. and then get a few hours of sleep before I had to demo it to, some of the VIPs with that chunk-a-da happening just on the other side of the wall. But yeah, that was kind of the worst night I had for crunch mode, I remember.
After 4 additional months of 16-hour shifts, 3 a.m. debugging sessions, and nights sleeping in the office, the last version of Sinistar was finally ready to deploy. The final date mentioned in the codebase is March 24th, just 24 hours before the game was unleashed at the 1983 AOE show. The second outing of Sinistar seemed to be much more of a proper grand reveal, with both upright and sit-down cabinets available to play at the Williams booth. Thanks to the refined features and bug fixes, the press reception this time was very positive. John Holstrom, best known as the founding editor of Punk magazine, wrote a glowing review for Sinistar in the July 1983 issue of Video Games magazine. Sinistar was originally showcased at the AMOA in late November of last year, but necessary improvements held up its release. Well, whatever they did to it worked, because it's now a very strong science fiction shooting game. In many ways, it's not surprising since Williams has slowly become a code word for quality among many arcaders. Sinistar has excellent graphics, good gameplay, strong motivation, fast action, and good sound effects. All in all, I don't know what else anyone could want from a good outer space shooting game. As more positive trade magazine reviews kept coming in, and as the field tests showed that players were loving the game, it seemed like Sinistar would be the company's next hit. Noah recalls witnessing the hype for himself when a large group of players were congregating around a Sinistar machine at one of the test locations. Early sales numbers seemed to confirm this anticipation as the game ultimately reached 3rd place according to Replay magazine's charts. Later in the year, Williams drummed up more publicity for the game by having Sinistar appear in the music video for Almost Over You by Sheena Easton, released in October 1983. At one point in the video, Sheena pushes a fake Defender cabinet off of a high-rise balcony. It's an oddly fitting visual metaphor for what was about to unfold for the coin-op industry. By the time Sinistar hit the show floor at AOE, the North American video game crash of 1983 was already underway. Last year's diminishing sales were showing no signs of stopping, and even though Sinistar received much better reviews after AOE, the commercial impact it could have made was softened by the impending collapse of coin-op. While it definitely wasn't the worst-selling arcade machine ever made, Sinistar began struggling to make sales, and only somewhere between 5,000 and 12,000 units were sold. About 200 of these machines are the sit-down cabinets with stereo sound, and only a handful of Duramold cabinets are known to exist. As a way to save money, some operators eventually had their Sinistar cabinets converted into other games, a sad but common fate for arcade machines in general, as conversion kits became the new trend. Future Williams games like Blaster and Mystic Marathon were sold in multiple options, including kits that could be used to swap out the old unprofitable game hardware with the new game equipment. For many, arcade machines were often seen as disposable devices with no reason to keep around once they were out of commission. Normally, this is where the story ends for a commercially unsuccessful video game, but as fate would have it, the Sinistar machines that survived into the future continued to leave a memorable impact on the players who came back for more, although the game's cult status wouldn't start to emerge and become apparent until at least a decade later.
Sinistar had so many groundbreaking things were all kind of packed together, and we built it all in, I guess it took a little more than a year. We were aiming at about 9 months, but things ran late. And to figure out all that stuff, in that short amount of time and get it out there, I only wish we had been a few months faster, because we released it just as the crash was happening, and there probably would have been 2 or 3 times as many units sold and out there if we had been a little bit faster. But of course, none of us knew the industry was going to basically, be going down the toilet about that time.
As the video game crash began to affect Williams Electronics, the writing on the wall was clear. The days of 55,000 unit sales were long gone. They desperately needed their next game to be profitable or else. In April 1983, after Sinistar was finished and released to the public, Sam knew it was time to move on from Williams and the coin-op industry. He went out to California and discovered a small startup working on a top-secret project that appeared to be both a home video game console and a personal computer. Sam quickly realized the hardware was way more powerful than anything he had worked with at Williams, and recognizing that the future of gaming was going to be through home consoles, he agreed to take the job. That small company would end up becoming Amiga Corporation. Meanwhile, in Chicago, the remaining Sinistar engineers were already back to work on their next project. During the same AMOA 82 show where Sinistar first premiered, a new kind of video game was revealed at the Sega booth that had grabbed a lot of attention. Astron Belt was one of the first games to use Laserdisc technology to display actual video footage with digital pixel art superimposed over it. For the first time ever, video games were starting to look just like the movies. Many attendees and industry experts at the show were anxious about an impending video game crash after the coin-op market cooled during the summer of '82. The industry was desperate for something new and exciting to revitalize sales. Engineers had their doubts early on, but operators and executives felt that Laserdisc was the next best thing. They thought it was going to be the savior of the coin-op industry. Williams, along with several other companies, immediately started looking into developing their own Laserdisc games. In typical Williams fashion, the company wanted something innovative and unique to set their game apart from the rest. A few months later, the engineers came up with the disc scan system, which uses a piece of hardware called the expander board that allows the video to pan left and right depending on the player's movements. This creates a sliding window effect that feels more immersive and interactive than other Laserdisc titles. Shortly after the AMOA show, Rich Witt was asked to be one of the lead software engineers on Williams' next big project. He began work before Sinistar was finished to give the new game a jump start. At the 1983 AOE show, Sinistar was again overshadowed by another Laserdisc game. This time it was Dragon's Lair. The hype surrounding the game convinced Williams to continue going with the disc scan system for their debut Laserdisc title, and by late April, a handful of Williams employees submitted game proposals that could utilize the new tech. Noah sketched out a couple of game concepts, including one based on the sci-fi tabletop game Ogre that involved shooting down enemies like helicopters and tanks. John Newcomer tried to pitch his own Laserdisc game concept, but Mike Stroll ultimately chose a pre-existing proposal by Python Angelo for a motorcycle racing game and changed it into a Laserdisc product. Again, thanks to RJ's email, we know this game was initially titled as Vroom. It continued to shuffle through numerous working titles, including Dream Rider, before eventually settling on Star Rider. Much like its predecessor, Star Rider is a historic engineering marvel that is worth taking a closer look at. To create the racetracks and otherworldly digital visuals, Williams contracted a special effects company in South Bend, Illinois named Computer Creations to render CGI backgrounds for the project. To make the racetrack footage feel even more interactive, the speed of the video changes depending on the player twisting the throttle or pressing on the brakes. Rich was again responsible for a large chunk of the game code, plus coordinating with the CGI animators and creating the interface that controls and syncs the Laserdisc player to the game engine. Just like with Sinistar, he also added a couple of Easter eggs in Star Rider. His name can be found twice inside the game's picture interface ROM. Speaking of Easter eggs, if you play Star Rider and make it to the Milky Way track, look out for a mini Sinistar appearing on the top left side of the screen. In Noah's engineering logbook, he wrote down the idea of having many familiar Williams characters appear in Star Rider cameos, including the Defender player ship and the ostrich mount from Joust. But only the Sinistar and the Joust Easter eggs made it to the final game. Mike Metz and RJ resumed working together to provide programming for auxiliary special effects, while Noah tackled the intelligence routines for the opponent bikers. Ken Lance continued to manage the software department and work alongside the hardware engineers to make the complex technology required for Star Rider a reality. Jack Hager returned to his pixel art duties on the project as well, though Python was responsible for the art direction. Almost 300 unique sprites were drawn from scratch for all the different biker positions that are plotted onto the racetrack during gameplay. With all this novel, complex hardware being created, Star Rider was turning into an even more ambitious game than Sinistar. The final budget was totaled at $4 million, 4 times the amount of a normal video game project at Williams. If the game was profitable, then the disc-scan system could be reused for additional Laserdisc titles in the future. But if it didn't, then things for the company would go south really quick. It goes without saying that the fate of Williams Electronics were resting on the success of Star Rider. By late summer of '83, the burnout and low morale from the constant overtime was taking its toll. Soon, other Williams engineers dropped the projects they were working on to help finish Star Rider on schedule. With the deadline fast approaching, more planned game features, like additional racetracks and a speech synthesizer, were cut. Meanwhile, as coin-op sales continued to plummet, Williams reported in September that Sinistar had underperformed and sales for the third quarter were down by 20% compared to the previous year. On November 4th, the first wave of layoffs began. Many people, including Ken Lance and Noah Falstein, were let go. As far as I know, none of Noah's biker intelligence code appears in the final game. Shortly after the staff reduction, Rich was asked to hand over his main project tasks to Bill Futzenreuter in order to work on ironing out the remaining timing issues with the Laserdisc interface. Rich's logbook notes then stop after November 16th. Futz and the surviving Williams engineers worked non-stop to finish the game, and in February 1984, Star Rider was released to the public in a rushed state. But it was too late. After Dragon's Lair came out in June 1983, Laserdisc games were already becoming a fad 6 months later. Before the end of the year, operators discovered that the disc players were constantly breaking down from extended usage in the arcade environment. Williams were hoping to sell at least 10,000 Star Rider machines, but in the end, only a few thousand units were sold, with even more units sitting inside the warehouse. Over 70 people were laid off as the company reported a loss of $50 million. If it wasn't for several diversifying tactics, along with the revival of pinball in the mid-80s, Williams may have not survived the crash at all. The scarcity of Star Rider, plus the game's complicated hardware, have made preservation and playing the game through emulation a very difficult challenge. The only way to enjoy Star Rider these past 4 decades is to be lucky enough to find a cabinet in person, but even the few remaining machines that are still around today are starting to malfunction. Efforts are already underway to prevent the game from being lost forever. But before we get into that, let's take a look at the Amiga computer, a device that shares a surprising amount of connections with Sinistar. During Star Rider's development, RJ was receiving offers to work at Amiga. He was initially hesitant and turned him down a couple of times before an incident made him change his mind. While preparing to get ready for a vacation trip, RJ, Rich, and Noah were moving an Atari Red Baron cabinet on a dolly when it started to tip over. RJ used his body to protect the heavy cabinet from falling on the ground, hurting his knee in the process. The arcade machine was saved, but the injury required him to use crutches. He was unable to join his friends on the trip, but he finally had some time to look into Amiga. Once he saw that this video game console was actually a powerful business computer, he immediately agreed to take the job. Not only did Sam and RJ reunite, Jack Hager came on board as the company's resident artist, designing the logos and creating many beloved pieces of art using the Amiga. When the Amiga 1000 premiered in 1985, Jack got the opportunity to demonstrate the computer's artistic tools on stage with none other than Andy Warhol and Debbie Harry.
What computers have you worked on before?
Oh, I've worked on anything. I've waited for this one.
Really?
Among the many things Sam contributed to the Amiga was the sound hardware architecture and sound driver, which was developed concurrently with the Amiga exec multitasking kernel by Carl Sassenrath. Coincidentally, the Amiga kernel shares the same name with Sam's multitasking exec routine from Sinistar. As for RJ, he worked on Intuition, the graphical user interface that serves as a friendly front end to the operating system. In the leaked source code for Amiga OS, RJ actually mentions Sinistar and the dev team in a comment. While at the 1984 CES show in Las Vegas, RJ and Amiga engineer Dale Luck created a prototype version of the Boing Ball, an audiovisual demo that could show off the powerful capabilities of the Amiga to investors at the show. Later versions of the program added more improvements, with Sam recording and digitizing a reverberating bounce sound effect. Boing Ball has gone on to become one of the most famous pieces of software from Amiga Corporation. It inspired others to create their own mind-blowing demos, with the Amiga being one of the main platforms that supported the emerging demo scene subculture in Europe. After Amiga Corporation was purchased outright by Commodore, over 4 million computers were sold before the computer was discontinued in 1994. While it wasn't the Apple killer that it had set out to be, its legacy can be seen in the diverse, talented, and devoted fan base that still maintains a strong presence today. After RJ left Amiga in 1987, he returned to the game industry and co-designed not one, but two separate video game platforms, the Atari Lynx, the first handheld with a backlit color screen, and the 3DO. Not long after his departure from Williams, Noah Falstein secured a job at Lucasfilm's brand new games division, joining the company in February 1984. Inside his Sinistar module, there are several references to Star Wars, which seems rather prophetic.
The subroutine for the asteroid swarms is called Han Solo, which is, I mean, considering what you know, down the road, like what you'd be doing, like that's just like a great synchronicity right there that I thought was really cool.
Oh, yeah. Well, it was when I was at Williams that Return of the Jedi came out, and all of us went to see the opening night and got there 6 hours earlier. You know, RJ, I think, organized a lot of it, and it started to rain, and someone, maybe it was RJ, had this huge plastic tarp in his car and brought it out, and there were maybe 10 of us holding this plastic thing over our heads because nobody had umbrellas. But we were all so excited about getting to see this movie on opening night, and it was less than a year later that I got the job at Lucasfilm. You know, you can imagine what a dream it was like to be, you know, seeing those movies and thinking how cool it was, and then to be working for the company that made it. It was a really fun time. It was. I appreciate the fact that we were breaking such new ground, that nobody was around to kind of tell us how things should be done, because it was all brand new, and we made a lot of mistakes that we wouldn't if we had people who are more experienced helping us. But I'm very grateful to have had that experience, because there's something really liberating about being a pioneer with stuff like that, you know, I still, in the kind of work I do today.
His first project at Lucasfilm was Coronis Rift, partly named after his asteroid mining game from college. Other working titles that Noah came up with include Alien Technology and Tanks a Lot. As a successor to David Fox's Rescue on Fractalis, Coronis Rift builds upon the use of fractal code by Pixar co-founder Lauren Carpenter, who also created the fractal landscapes seen in the Genesis sequence from Star Trek II. Much like how he helped RJ get a job at Williams, Noah had a hand in recruiting several people for Lucasfilm who went on to have successful careers like Ron Gilbert, Steve Purcell, and Tim Schafer, just to name a few. One of Noah's favorite credits is from Monkey Island 2, where he's listed as the game's goofy pun consultant. In addition to his contributions on the Monkey Island games, he also assisted with early concept work on Habitat, one of the very first MMORPG games ever made, and notable for containing the first use of the term avatar to describe a customizable player character. His work on Battlehawks 1942 and Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis earned LucasArts 2 Game of the Year awards, with the latter title being among the most successful LucasArts games, surpassing 1 million unit sales. As we summarize the facts, it's easy to understand why Sinistar is such an important, distinguished title in the history of video games. The project was delayed multiple times and was nearly canceled, but through the perseverance of everyone involved, Sam's game engine survived and became something greater. Not only did Sinistar raise the bar for gaming in terms of controls, graphics, and audio, it served as the launching pad for many careers that later directly influenced the gaming and PC industries well into the mid-'80s and beyond.
What would be the one thing you would tell yourself, like that you wish you knew back then that you knew now?
Besides, what would be now buy Microsoft stock probably when I was 25. I would say the thing that I regret the most is that I have not had the best work habits of just being productive. And it has taken me a long time to kind of deal with my own personal demons about that. And I wish I had started working on those things a lot earlier, because I would have gotten a whole lot more done over these last 40 years. But I frankly, I'm not quite sure, what I could have told the 25-year-old version of me that would have really stuck, if I had a few minutes with that person. If I could spend a week, maybe I could have, put him on a different path.
As someone who wasn't even alive when Sinistar came out, I wish to express my gratitude to the many people responsible for preserving the game long after it disappeared from arcades. These efforts would have been impossible without the emergence of the internet in the 1990s. People who grew up both terrified and enthralled by that screaming intergalactic skull were starting to express their appreciation of the game online, and by the end of the decade, numerous Sinistar fan pages had cropped up throughout the World Wide Web. In 1995, a company called Digital Eclipse was among the first to resurrect arcade games through emulators. Thanks to their work, classic titles were ported to home consoles and computers using the original ROM data. Bonus features were eventually included in their compilation releases, such as interviews with the game designers and trivia. Emulator developer Jeff Vavasseur explains on his archived website that Sinistar was a late addition to Digital Eclipse's first video game product, Williams Arcade Classics. Jeff is also the same person who figured out the steps to trigger the hidden Sinistar Easter eggs. Sinistar appeared for the first time on home consoles in 1996 with the SNES port of Williams Arcade Classics. The SNES wasn't powerful enough to handle emulation, so a more conventional port was produced instead. However, they had a trick up their sleeves that made the port very faithful to the original. Jeff reveals on his archived website that Larry DeMar had somehow preserved the source code for 5 Williams games, including Sinistar, and that the code was used as reference to make the SNES ports as accurate as possible. Then, in 1999, THQ unexpectedly published a Sinistar sequel for PC called Sinistar Unleashed, which took gameplay elements from the original and put them into a 3D game engine, featuring some fairly advanced hardware-accelerated graphics at the time and giving the player ship 6 degrees of freedom. When development started 2 years earlier, the project was originally titled Out of the Void and had nothing to do with Sinistar. It was only after THQ acquired the license to Sinistar from Midway Games that the project was reworked as a sequel. As a result, the game feels very different from its namesake. The fast-paced arcade gameplay and the panic of being chased by the Sinistar is gone, replaced with overly complicated controls and new various types of Sinistar bosses, which are just weird biomechanical space creatures with awkward voice acting.
Run, run, run! I am a Sinistar.
On the plus side, there's some halfway decent late 90s music and sound design, but unfortunately the game painfully lacks what makes the original so fun and exciting. Digital Eclipse continued to re-release and update the collection of arcade games as the world entered into the new millennium. It was through the port of Midway's Arcade Treasures on the GameCube that I got my first taste of the Williams Electronics catalog. The year was 2005 and I was 14 at the time. My first playthrough with the game ended quickly in a jump scare as the roaring Sinistar zoomed in and pulverized me. I was simultaneously shocked and mesmerized by what just transpired, and before I knew it, the game had become a new favorite. To continue feeding my fascination, the supplemental materials included in the arcade compilation provided detailed production notes and trivia, including video interviews with RJ Michael. Looking back, I realized these interviews and notes planted a seed in my mind that eventually became the documentary you're currently viewing right now. As a teen, I often thought about modding Sinistar and making a new version with reduced difficulty, similar to what RJ previously described. But back then, my programming knowledge was very limited, and I was easily discouraged by repeated failures. As the years went by, my attention turned to other pursuits, and the time spent with Sinistar dropped off, but I never forgot how much of an indelible impression it had left on me. Then, in March 2023, after watching a documentary about Jack Hager's pixel art on the Amiga, I was reminded of Sinistar and went online to do a search query. That's when I discovered the game's source code was leaked on GitHub in April 2021, along with Defender, Stargate, Robotron, and Joust.
I don't recall how I heard about it, but I just was, kind of shocked and very pleased. I knew that various versions of it had been preserved. The last I heard was that, there were some printouts because, of course, this is, all in the era before thumbsticks or other convenient ways to save stuff. And, I wasn't even sure if there were any digital copies that were possible at that point. But yeah, it was kind of like this, gift out of nowhere. I'd been sure that it was gone for a long time. And I've got source code to some of the stuff that I did in college before I got into the industry. That's all printouts. And I keep thinking one of these days I should just scan it all and put it online so that people can play with that stuff. But that's all written in a archaic language called APL that hardly anybody uses these days. So it'd be real cyber-archaeology to dissect it and get it running again.
My understanding of computer science had greatly improved since the first time playing Sinistar, but I still couldn't do anything with the code without learning to understand assembly language. Now, what's fascinating about the leaked code is that these are the original digital source files. Some surviving source code from other games are not as lucky, as they only exist in listing printouts that could be potentially hundreds or even thousands of pages long. Of course, this requires much more work since the source files need to be recreated digitally first before any attempt can be made to assemble the game from scratch. The other benefit to preserving a codebase digitally is that any unused files that were not included in the final program are still kept safe. Though I couldn't read 6809 assembly yet, it didn't take long to find out that the code base for Sinistar and Joust were both written for an assembler that doesn't exist anymore, so it was not possible to immediately produce a copy of either game. I also found out that shortly after the Williams code had leaked, a GitHub user by the name of MWedge had retargeted the source code for Defender and Robotron. His work proved that with a little bit of effort, it was possible to build these games directly from the source code using modern tools. The problem was that out of all the surviving Williams source code, Sinistar had the largest code base with over 275 files, while the second largest, Joust, had just 49. The silver lining is that a surprising amount of the Sinistar files are unused and were not necessary to build the final game. Some of them are just empty dummy files, or toolchain scripts and macros written specifically for the missing assembler, so it's okay for us to skip those. The other unused content are miscellaneous notes and garbage files, but a small handful of files appear to have code that's been removed from the final game. No matter how you sliced it, editing all that code to make it work again would not be a quick process. Having a background in audio and music, I thought it might be easier for me to mess around with the sound effects first instead of immediately tackling the game logic. To my chagrin, I realized the source code for the sound ROM was missing entirely. Fortunately, the sound source files for other Williams games did survive, and because the engineers kept reusing sound code, it was theoretically possible to use these as reference and reconstruct the Sinistar sound program. After going through a self-imposed crash course in assembly language basics, I was able to slowly piece together the missing code, creating a fully commented and detailed source file that allows us to rebuild the sound ROM from scratch, including the rare second sound ROM found in the cockpit cabinet. The findings and research from that project led me to make my first video about Sinistar. Once that documentary was complete, my initial intentions were to take a break, but I admit it was impossible to stop thinking about that leaked source code. I had so many questions. Is the codebase complete enough to build Sinistar correctly? What unused features and debug options are hidden inside? How much rewriting is needed to get things working again? Do the proper tools to build the game even exist? To answer all these questions, I was left with no choice but to proceed with retargeting the entire Sinistar codebase.
I'm so impressed that you did this self-taught and, in an era where there weren't a whole bunch of other people who were doing it that you could talk to about it. At least you have the internet now, so you can find those people even though they're on the other side of the planet. But it's still really impressive because assembly is bizarre, and looking at what we had back then, seeing this stuff on the screen right now, it's amazing to me that we got anything running at all, much less that we're able to make the kind of sophisticated games that we did.
The assembler I was using for the sound code was not robust enough to handle the complex macros and syntax of the Sinistar codebase. The assembler M-Wedge used for Robotron and Defender didn't work either, so I spent a considerable amount of time trying to find something best suited for the job. Before finding a substitute assembler, further examination of the codebase resulted in uncovering many unused files that had survived, like Mike's AMOA title screen and a mysterious file in Sam's module that turned out to be the never-before-seen thruster effect. Figuring out how to re-implement these features were my first experiments. Inside the attract mode source file, RJ wrote some instructions on how to re-enable the original title screen, which was very helpful. Trying to find space to hold the newly restored code was yet another challenge that we'll get more into shortly. Surprisingly, the title screen code preserved in the codebase is actually newer than what we see in the AMOA build because the logo was repositioned slightly, presumably to make room for the added operator message underneath the large graphic. My first attempt at re-enabling the thruster effect was only partially successful because the flames were just blue pixels. Of course, this being the first time witnessing these new graphics, I had no idea that the colors were incorrect. Motivated by the excitement of these new discoveries, I focused next on modifying the enemy population tables. A month of studying and experiments went by, and after some extensive playtesting, the reduced difficulty mod was finished on October 7th, 2023. While playtesting, I was curious to see what it was like to zero out all the enemy population numbers. It's really quite bizarre to play the game with no warriors or workers floating around. This is even more apparent when the player is able to bomb the Sinistar effortlessly without any interference. With the risk and reward element taken away, the tense gameplay suddenly becomes amusingly boring. While I don't consider my mod as a replacement for the final difficulty tunings, I do like to think of the difficulty mod as a practice mode where the imposed 2-minute playtime restriction no longer matters. These successful attempts at creating new mods and re-implementing lost code for Sinistar encouraged me to continue moving forward with retargeting the game's codebase. Some extensive testing with various assemblers led me to a program called Macro Assembler AS that supports a lot of the idiosyncrasies found in the codebase. I officially started retargeting the source code on November 6, despite my own concerns regarding the feasibility of this undertaking. The beginning was one of the most difficult parts of the project, as I had to learn how to identify which parts of the original code that AS couldn't understand correctly, and replace the old instructions with their modern equivalent, a process that was sometimes far from clear-cut. I had to get into the groove of editing code in a way that was transparent and showed what the original code looked like. For this, I used these fix me comments whenever the assembler didn't like that particular line of code and pasted the original line of code there for context. As mentioned earlier, those symbol listing files that the 4 programmers generated were extremely helpful for whenever I had to piece together code. Since these files contained all the symbols in the game, plus their exact location in the machine code, they were constantly referenced as the source code was slowly pieced back together one file at a time. A week's work had passed when I had reached the first milestone and completed Sam's module. Due to its independent nature, it was possible to emulate the assembled code inside MAME, marking the first time I would see the bare-bones version of Sinistar with Sam's standalone game engine. Rich's module took the longest to retarget because of the enormous amount of code. His section took a few more weeks to complete, but when I fired it up in the emulator, almost nothing had changed. It turns out that Noah's module is required to connect everything together and make the gameplay semi-functional. With the first 3 modules included in the build, the game is finally playable now. However, omitting RJ's code means there's no status screen in between turns, and more importantly, it's impossible to progress to the next zone because RJ's Sinistar explosion routine is what actually triggers Rich's warp sequence. In this incomplete version, if the player hits the Sinistar with enough bombs, the Sinistar will think it's dead, but the explosion and warp sequence never start, so the player is stuck on level 1. Once the player dies and respawns, the Sinistar returns to its chasing state. Again, even though the killing Sinistar routine exists inside Rich's module, it is never called by RJ's code, so the game gets stuck in this loop. As the retargeting project progressed, the number of non-matching bytes got smaller, and by the time RJ's module was finished, the game was very nearly complete. All that remained were the numerous patches written after the AMOA show and the diagnostics. On January 12, 2024, 40 years and 9 months after the game's reveal at AOE, after 9 weeks of challenging work, a new build of Sinistar was assembled and loaded inside of MAME without any checksum errors. It was an absolutely momentous occasion. However, there were some loose ends that needed resolving. To prevent the sound ROM code from getting separated and lost again, I added the reconstructed source file back inside the Sinistar codebase. The speech data was also disassembled and reverse engineered a few days later, and those new speech files were included in the repository too, thus completely restoring the entire ROM set. It was now truly finished. The once dormant Sinistar code finally lives again. It was now time to start figuring out a proper way to restore the deleted features and make a new definitive version of Sinistar, the way the programmers intended. In order to restore deleted routines, like the title screen and thruster effect, I needed to insert the code back into the game program, but there was not enough ROM space remaining. Something would have to be overwritten, and it had to be code that's not used during gameplay. This meant only one thing: we needed to nuke the diagnostics. The game's diagnostic code takes up the entirety of the last chip on the ROM board and is considered a separate program from the game. By overwriting the rarely used CRT test pattern and color bar screens, we effectively unlock a decent chunk of storage to add more code and mods to Sinistar. Adding back the thruster special effect correctly this time revealed its true nature, a much more interesting flame effect. For the past 20 years, I was so used to seeing the player ship without a tail that witnessing the proper effect for the first time was an absolutely surreal experience, to say the least.
I remember even seeing the special effect that you showed me that you had found commented out with the sparkles in the exhaust of the ship. It was so weird because it was this weird deja vu moment where it's like, oh yeah, I remember seeing it do that. And I'm pretty sure that was something that we just ran out of room and we cut that because it was optional to cram everything else in. But it's kind of uncanny seeing the stuff that you were able to dig out of the code there that I had not thought about in 40 years.
Because of the similarities between the two code bases, I started looking into retargeting the source code for Joust. By applying what I had learned from my previous undertaking, retargeting jousts was completed in a matter of days rather than months. I showed the Sinistar mods and joust findings to my friend Brad Riddell, an arcade collector and expert on Williams hardware. He told me about this cool joust pause mod written back in 2008 and asked me if I could come up with something similar for Sinistar. I thought it would be a fun challenge, so I disassembled and reverse engineered the joust pause mod and then rewrote the code to work specifically with Sinistar. As the number of Sinimods started growing, I was struggling to find a way to keep track of them all. Brad gave me an idea taken from the 2014 tie-dye version of Robotron, where the high score is used to denote a version number. In Sinistar, the first high score entry in the Survivors Today table is always set to 19045. We changed the middle zero here to let us quickly know which combination of mods are currently installed. I wanted to see if it was possible to make that perfect ROM set RJ was talking about, so I set out to make a special definitive version of the game that recreates as close as possible to what the dev team originally intended. This 645 version retains the game's final difficulty tuning and restores the tail routine and title screen, along with the original default 5,000 points for bonus ships. Brad also volunteered to help out with burning these mods on real ROM chips to make sure they could run on original hardware, and after some troubleshooting with the Watchdog circuit, we got the game working without any issues.
The latest ROM hack that I worked on is the most ambitious one yet. I implemented a new feature inspired by Blaster that makes the game easier, but still uses Noah and Sam's final difficulty tuning and maintains that intense gameplay Sinistar is known for. In this mod, the player now initializes on every turn with 3 shields, and a warrior shot will annihilate one of them if it collides with the player ship. The player must have at least 1 shield at all times, or they will be killed. This means you get 2 more tries before dying on a 3rd shot. If the player has a full bomb bay, and they are missing shields, then an extra crystal will restore 1 shield. There are several unused sound effects in the Sinistar sound ROM, including one that would later appear in Blaster as the sound cue when a player is hit. I decided to use it again for the exact same purpose in Sinistar. Whenever the player collides with a warrior shot, the screen flashes yellow, a new sound call is triggered, and a new message appears next to the scanner. If the player is lucky enough to restore a crystal shield, a second sound call is triggered that combines 2 existing audio cues into a simple rhythmic sequence. The new color cycling effect is something I'm proud of, as it produces a Defender-like rainbow effect using only a single instruction that's called on every frame, so its impact on performance is very minimal. In order for all this code to fit, a special tiny version of the diagnostic ROM was made that only retains the ROM and RAM tests along with the game adjustment screen. A new convenient option was added on this screen as well, which allows the player or arcade operator to enable or disable the pause mod.
As if retargeting Sinistar and making this documentary wasn't enough, my attention turned to preserving the successor of Sinistar, the unemulated black sheep of Williams Electronics, known as Star Rider. I've always been fascinated by this game, ever since I first encountered it years ago on the Unmaimed website. In the 2000s, Star Rider had fallen into obscurity, with screenshots from the arcade flyer being the only visuals I could find online for years. Information was so scarce that, for the longest time, I thought the game was an unreleased prototype. It wasn't until 2010 that video of Star Rider's gameplay was finally uploaded onto YouTube, including the famous mini Sinistar cameo. Taking on this task, while also juggling other projects and commitments, was going to be tough, but there was a good reason why this needed to be done so soon. Disc rot has become a growing concern for all optical media, especially aging laserdiscs. I felt it was imperative to properly preserve Star Rider's video data even if emulation wasn't currently possible. While the game's ROMs have been saved, previously existing video rips of the Laserdisc have been improperly compressed with lossy video codecs. There's also the fact that the Williams engineers found a sneaky way of embedding game data inside the analog video signal that corresponds with the racetrack obstacles. In order to preserve this hidden data, we need to recapture the analog video from a Laserdisc that hasn't degraded yet. As the game reached its 40th anniversary in February 2024, I contacted a few people to ask for their help and coordinated with them to save Star Rider from becoming lost. Thanks to an arcade collector named Glitch, Laserdisc game expert Matt Omby, and preservation specialist Biomonk, an original Star Rider Laserdisc was captured using a Domesday device. This captures the raw RF signal from the Laserdisc player, providing the best way of digitally preserving the analog video signal, including the embedded game data. Working with a Domesday device requires powerful computer hardware specs and storage to record everything off of the disc. The raw files for these captures are huge, with just one disc side scaling in at around 28 gigabytes. We were also very lucky that this particular Laserdisc copy of Star Rider showed virtually no signs of disc rot. In the meantime, I started looking through Star Rider's vast amount of ROMs and quickly realized the game's sprites were partially visible inside a lot of them. During my spare time, I created new source code files that accurately matched up with the original sprite image data. Matt Omby also did very extensive research on the game several years ago and posted his software and hardware findings online, as well as sending me some of his own disassembly files and notes. About 8 months later, while doing research for this documentary, I got in touch with a former video game developer from Basque Country in northern Spain named Joseba Ipalza. For the past 16 years, he's been working on and off on a Star Rider emulator written in FreeBasic, and for a while he was showing off his progress on YouTube. He got his emulator working to the point where it was actually running the game and displaying sprites with corrupted colors. Looking over the code he uploaded on GitHub, I came up with a fix for the color palette and sent him over the patch, while also telling him about the new video capture. Joseba then revealed to me that he stopped working on the emulator because the video file he acquired was missing frames and unable to sync up with the game engine. I sent over the new video, and then Joseba modified his emulator code to display it during gameplay, though syncing the footage was still an issue. Using Matt's disassembly notes and a custom jerry-rigged memory viewer, I came up with some FreeBasic code that roughly simulates what the Star Rider hardware does and managed to get the game engine to queue up the correct video frames. On October 5th, I got Joseba's emulator to finally play the background video correctly at the proper frame rates. Once the attract mode started playing and the bikers were actually following the racetrack background, I knew that was it. We had finally accomplished our goal. Not only was the game working in an emulator for the very first time, but it could be played from start to finish without any game-breaking bugs. One thing that surprised me after getting the game up and running was the embedded code inside the video signal doesn't actually control the logic for the opponent bikers as originally thought. I think this data is used for masking out sprites in specific areas, such as preventing a biker from appearing in front of an obstacle when it's supposed to be obstructed by it. Soon, more and more imperfections with the emulation were eliminated, and before long, video panning and color palette cycling were added, bringing the emulated graphics very close to the real deal. Of course, the emulator is far from finished. The overall emulation speed is too fast, and sound is still missing, but the race against disc rot is over, and we can rest a little bit easier now. More Star Rider discs from different sources have already been captured, and with the digitized analog signals from these multiple discs, they can be stacked together to further eliminate video dropouts and generate an even more accurate capture of the Laserdisc data. For 4 decades, the ending of the story behind Star Rider has been a sad one, but through software preservation and emulation, a new chapter can be added with hopefully a proper conclusion. The colossal effort put into developing the game will not go to waste, as Star Rider finally has a chance to receive a new audience of players, and maybe even get some new mods too while we're at it. Unlike other IP from Williams, Sinistar has maintained a presence in gaming pop culture well beyond the 80s. This can be easily seen with the sizable amount of fan art and parodies that have been created throughout the years. The Sinistar has appeared in everything from cakes to comics, and even mods for other games like Friday Night Funkin'. With no previous experience working with assembly, retargeting the codebase and helping rescue Star Rider were some of the most daunting things I ever did. There were many moments when doubts were rampant, and I just wanted to throw in the towel. Sometimes I questioned the overall importance of the project, but I realized this was an opportunity to prove to myself that this goal was actually possible. Ever since building bit-accurate Sinistar ROMs and getting to play Star Rider for the first time, the sense of accomplishment that followed has been immensely cathartic.
The most important thing I learned of all of this was, when I'm just this kid from the south side of Chicago, and I got involved in this whole thing, but I'm still just this guy. And the truth of the matter is that anyone could do this. I proved that finally to myself, that I could go off and follow a dream and have it come true for me. And you could too.
Today, the 4 main software engineers of Sinistar are still around. Sam is currently a senior audio software engineer at Apple, while RJ is director of games at Google. And since 1996, Noah has been the second longest-serving freelance game designer in the world, with his current primary focus involving games tailored specifically for healthcare.
It's been really enjoyable for me having to use everything I learned about making good entertainment and adding this extra layer of having something that can treat ADHD or depression or help somebody recover from a stroke. I mean, the list goes on and on of all the ways that games are now being used to train doctors to treat illnesses, to help patients understand what's going on. And yeah, it's really fulfilling and very exciting to find that there are, edges of things that are just as Wild West as the whole video game world was, back when I was working on Sinistar, where nobody knows what's going to work. So you try something and you test it, and sometimes you throw it away, and other times a lot of these games are turning out to be as effective or more effective than drugs without the bad side effects and the fact that they can scale. And unlike a drug, you can make a game and then suddenly next week 1 million people can be using it.
As mentioned previously, Rich is a private individual, so it was truly a pleasant surprise to have received a brief email from him shortly after completing the retargeting project. Some people like Eugene Jarvis, Jack Hager, and John Newcomer continue to be involved with the video game and coin-op industries, while many other Williams engineers like Mike Metz and Ken Lance have since moved on from game software. But after corresponding with all of them, I can tell they are still proud of their work, and they are amazed that 42 years later, people are still talking about Sinistar. I've really enjoyed this. Thank you for making my day.
Oh, thanks for, caring so much. You never know that something you did, someone's going to actually like, I worked on so many things, but those are fun days for me, and to hear that I thought nobody even knew what the game was,
Nobody expected that people were going to be remembering these games like 10 years later, because you're going, they're going to be going on to bigger and better hardware and stuff like that. It just brings a smile to my face every time, going, wow, that's really awesome that people still remember and play some of these games yet. I never thought that would happen.
To quote video game historian and preservationist Jason Scott, time has proven that people are starting to understand games are us. As corny as it sounds, a software engineer, much like any writer or artist, imbues a part of themselves into their own work. Because of this, everyone who contributed to Sinistar will forever be part of the game's DNA. Due to its low-level nature, assembly language is one of the most direct ways a human can speak to a CPU. However, a computer doesn't truly understand the significance behind any of the code it processes. That's why these routines and instructions are more than just ones and zeros to us. They are the recipes that create a dazzling explosion, or a scary taunting face, or the excitement of missing a huge volley of warrior shots. Like with any well-crafted video game, the dev team's design choices and intentions are carried out by the computer to become something more than just a commercial product. As we currently go through yet another video game industry crash, it's important to remind ourselves that a computer didn't design or generate our favorite video games from scratch. People did. And it is those traces of humanity that explain why players, young and old, still resonate with vintage games to this day. At the very end of our video interview, Noah said something to me that I will never forget.
I just wanted to thank you, Max, because this, as I said before, I had kind of given up a lot of the stuff for Lost, and it is really, I'm feeling very emotional here. It's just wonderful to have people, who weren't even born when these games come out, who really appreciate them, and it makes me feel like there's some legacy that will go on there. And I've got grandkids now. In fact, their other grandfather's also a game designer, and their father's a game designer. So I know they'll be interested in games. And it's nice to know that, when they grow up, they'll be able to, understand more about, what Grandpa Noah was doing, way back when. So thank you very much.